Chapter 633. Glass City. In the large study, young Master Qingchen, dressed in white, sat in the first chair below the head of the table. Looking at the empty chair in front of him, his handsome face was smiling, and his bearing was leisurely like an immortal. But the people sitting below him couldn't help but tremble. Young Master Qingchen's appearance was really too frightening. Young Master Qingchen, when exactly will Prince return? For more than a month, the border of Xiling has been increasing the number of troops. The others looked at the person who asked the question as if they were looking at an idiot. Didn't he see that young Master Qingchen was angry because Prince refused to return? He actually touched the pot that didn't boil. But then again, when exactly would Prince return? Xiling's border looked like a war was about to break out, but Prince still refused to return. Of course, it wasn't that they couldn't fight without Prince, but without Prince, they felt uncertain. Su Qingchen looked back and smiled faintly, his sword-like eyebrows slightly raised. After playing enough, Prince will naturally return. Then Xiling, didn't we also increase the number of troops? Xiling just wants to test the waters. Even if they want to fight? Prince should be back by the time the war really starts. If Mo Xiuyao returned after the war really started, they would directly throw him into the battlefield. Of course, Lier had to stay behind to guard Glass City. Everyone was silent. This young Master Qingchen was good at everything. He was even more efficient than Prince in handling political affairs. After all, young Master Qingchen had never been like Prince, who maliciously slacked off. And there were many things that his subordinates didn't understand. He only needed to casually give a few pointers to enlighten them. The only bad thing was that this young master's appearance was really too handsome. Moreover, he had the temperament of a banished immortal. When he smiled gently at you, most people would swallow the words they wanted to say. They couldn't even muster up the slightest bit of rebuttal. When this young master's smile had a hint of coldness to it, it was mostly related to their Prince Ding. Everyone felt a chill like the winter wind. Reporting to young Master Qingchen, the prince's princess consort has returned. The guard outside the door reported. A bright smile bloomed on Su Qingchen's handsome face. In an instant, it was as if spring had returned and hundreds of flowers had bloomed. However, most of the people present couldn't help but tremble. When young Master Qingchen revealed such a smile, it usually meant that someone was in trouble. Good, very good. Su Qingchen nodded with a smile. He stood up and glanced at everyone present. He smiled and said, "Everyone, let's go welcome His Highness." Prince Ding, who had been free and unfettered in the Chu capital for a long time, returned to the northwest. Before he could catch his breath, he was invited to the study by his most trusted military advisor and brother-in-law for a discussion. Originally, Yili felt very guilty for leaving everything to Su Qingchen and planned to help. However, eldest young Master Su's anger was clearly only directed at His Highness Prince Ding, so he very gently refused Yi Li's help and kindly told his cousin to rest well after the long journey back. As for the other matters, His Highness will take care of them. Yi Li felt that her eldest brother was grinding his teeth when he said that the prince would take care of them. Of course, her eldest brother wouldn't do something so indecent, but Yi Li still decided to listen to her eldest brother's orders and go rest. After all, she still had a few guests to settle down. In the originally empty guest courtyard deep in the Prince Ding mansion, there were already people waiting there. Yi Li had just walked to the entrance of the courtyard with the Empress and Hua Tianxiang when someone rushed out. "Princess Ding! Princess Ding! My mother! Mother, has mother come?" Princess Changle, who had not been seen for a long time, rushed out wearing a light purple dress embroidered with orchids. She happened to see the Empress walking beside Yi Li and could not help but be stunned. "Changle!" The Empress gazed at her daughter, whom she had not seen for almost a year. She had grown much taller and her complexion was better than when she had been in the imperial palace. Although she had heard Yi Li talk about her daughter's situation in the northwest, she could not help but tear up upon seeing the Empress. "Mother! Mother! Mother!" Princess Changle blinked her eyes, finally coming to her senses. With a cheer, she threw herself into the Empress' embrace. The 15-year-old girl was only slightly shorter than her mother. However, in front of the Empress, she was like a 7- or 8-year-old girl, beaming with smiles and acting spoiled. Standing to the side, Hua Tianxiang smiled at Princess Changle and said, "Changle can only see your mother. As expected, you have forgotten me, your older sister?" Only then did Princess Changle raise her head, looking at Hua Tianxiang, who was smiling at her. Embarrassed, she called out, "Older sister Tianxiang, older sister Wuyo, there's also me, there's also me." Unwilling to be left out, Mo Xiaobao extended his small hand, wanting to attract Princess Changle's gaze. Princess Changle had always had a good relationship with Mo Xiaobao. Smiling, she bent over and pinched his cheeks. Smiling, she said, "So it's Xiaobao. Is the Chu capital fun? Is this your new little friend?" Lang Junhan stood by Mo Xiaobao's side, blinking her large, limpid eyes as she gazed at the beautiful elder sister before her. Princess Chang'e was immediately attracted to the tender little bun before her. Compared to the mischievous Mo Xiaobao, who would sometimes even deceive her, this tender little darling before her was clearly more lovable. Along the way, even the Empress and Hua Tianxiang preferred to hug and caress Lang Junhan. This caused Mo Xiaobao to feel a trace of disappointment. "Not fun, however. I brought a present for older sister Wuyo. This is little dummy Lang, my new friend." Mo Xiaobao said with some disappointment. "Oh? You only brought a present for older sister Wuyo? Then what about us?" Clear and melodious laughter could be heard from behind the door. Two madams appeared at the door with Qin Zheng, who was holding the hand of a little boy. Smiling, they looked at Mo Xiaobao. Mo Xiaobao immediately cheered and threw himself into Madame Su's embrace. "Eldest aunt, second aunt, Xiaobao also brought a present for you. Little brother Jirue also brought a present." Su Jirue, who was only 4 years old, proudly snorted and snuggled into his mother's embrace. "I don't want your present. Who told you to sneak off to the Chu capital without bringing me along?" Mo Xiaobao's eyes turned. Beaming, he said, "If you don't want it, then forget it. I heard that General Lu's youngest son is about to celebrate his birthday. In a few days, I'll have someone send it to him. It just so happens that I forgot to prepare a birthday present for him." No matter how intelligent Su Jirue was, he was still a fair and tender little cutie when he was 4 years old. There was an essential difference between him and Mo Xiaobao, a black-hearted sesame seed. Hearing him say this, Xiao Mao's eyes immediately moistened. "Mother," Qin Zheng helplessly patted her son and comforted him. "Cousin is just joking with you. Right, I'm just joking. How can I give something to you to someone else? I'll have someone bring it to you later, okay?" Receiving his mother's warning gaze, Mo Xiaobao could only coax the little bun himself. Seeing the two little bun, who were less than 2 years apart, being comforted by adults, everyone couldn't help but cover their faces and laugh. Chapter 634. "All right, let's go in and talk. What's the meaning of stopping people at the door? We've already tidied up the courtyard in the past 2 days. Take a look and see if you like it or not." It was still second Madame Su who spoke as she led everyone into the courtyard. The Empress looked somewhat worriedly at Yi Li and asked, "Princess Consort, if we live in the Prince Ding mansion, will..." Their identities were different. If they were discovered to be living in Glass City, there would be some explanation. However, if they were discovered to be living in the Prince Ding mansion, it would likely affect the Prince Ding mansion's reputation. Yi Li smiled and patted the Empress's arm, saying, "You can stay here without worry. Not only the two of you, but Wuyo will also be moving back to the prince's residence. In the future, I'm afraid that Glass City will not be peaceful. Living in the Prince Ding mansion will be safer." Princess Chang'e nodded and said, "Mother, elder sister Tianxiang, the princess consort is correct. In 2 days, the two masters will also be moving back to the prince's residence. In the past few days, there have been many more people in Li City. Even the two masters' medical clinics have received several batches of people." Hearing her words, the Empress and Hua Tianxiang agreed. The group entered the reception pavilion. Sure enough, the furnishings within the pavilion were all newly changed. In addition, many of them were in the style of the Chu capital. It was obvious that the decorations had been meticulously arranged. After the host and guests were seated, a maid served tea before withdrawing. Only then did Yi Li speak, "Feel free to stay in the Prince Ding mansion. If you lack anything, just send someone to inform the steward. Just treat this place as your own home." Second Madame Su also smiled and said, "Lear is right. When you have time, there is no harm in coming to our home and sitting. Going out for a walk is also fine." Eldest Madame Su was not familiar with the Empress, but second Madame Su recognized the Empress. Now that they met again, she did not reveal the slightest bit of uneasiness on her face. It was as if these were truly the two old friends that Yi Li had brought back from the Chu capital. Instead, her gaze landed on Hua Tianxiang, who was chatting with Qin Zheng, and her eyes brightened. She looked at Yi Li tentatively. Yi Li couldn't help but laugh in her heart. She nodded without a trace. Of course, she understood second aunt's thoughts. In the past few years, her two aunts had almost broken their hearts over the marriage of her cousins. It just so happened that the Northwest was not as prosperous as the Chu capital to begin with. There were many aristocratic families here, so it was difficult to choose a few first-rate noble ladies. However, those cousins of hers refused to budge. It was obvious that they did not want to get married. Although second cousin was already married and had a child, third cousin was already the oldest after eldest brother. Compared to fourth brother and fifth brother who were in their early 20s, third brother was naturally more anxious. Now that he finally saw Hua Tianxiang, his eyes lit up. Even in the capital, Hua Tianxiang was one of the top young ladies. However, after so many years, although Hua Tianxiang still had a young lady's hairstyle, Madame Su was not sure if she was married or not. With Yi Li's affirmation, Madame Su looked at Hua Tianxiang with even more eagerness. Being stared at so passionately, Hua Tianxiang looked back at them in confusion. However, the Empress immediately understood Madame Su's thoughts. She smiled faintly but didn't say anything. The Su family was naturally a very good family. Tianxiang had also suffered a lot in the past few years. If something good could happen, it would be great. It would also be Tianxiang's luck. After settling Hua Tianxiang and the Empress, Yi Li thought about it and went to the study. In the study, Mo Xiuyao was buried in a thick stack of files. His writing was smooth as flowing water, but his expression was uglier than if he had stepped in feces. Sitting not far away was Feng Zhiyao, who had been dragged along by Mo Xiuyao to suffer with him. Feng Zhiyao's face turned green. He stole a glance at Mo Xiuyao, who was sitting behind the desk, then at Su Qingchen, who was leisurely flipping through a travel book. He helplessly buried his face back into the files. He couldn't afford to offend either of them. It was better to obediently hide his head and do his work. Su Qingchen put down the book and looked at the door with a smile. "Lear, why aren't you resting? What are you doing here?" Yi Li walked in with a cup of freshly brewed tea. She looked at Mo Xiuyao's ashen face and Su Qingchen's faint smile. She smiled and said, "I brought some tea and pastries over. Big brother has worked hard these days. Is there a lot to do?" Su Qingchen picked up the cup of tea that Yi Li had poured and sighed helplessly. As expected, a married daughter is like spilled water. Yi Li was helpless. She poured a cup of tea for Mo Xiuyao and Feng Zhiyao. Mo Xiuyao picked up the cup and took a sip. He sighed and complained, "Li, your big brother is torturing me. I haven't even had a sip of water since I came back. He wants me to finish reading all these by today." Yi Li looked at the booklets that were taller than Mo Xiuyao's head. She could only give him a sympathetic look. Su Qingchen leisurely brushed away the non-existent dust on his clothes. He smiled coldly and said, "Is it me torturing you, Prince? Or is it you who is torturing us to work like cows and horses? These are all the military and civil affairs of the Northwest during the time that Prince was not here. It includes the financial income and the analysis of the war reports at the border. So many of us have been working on this for 1 or 2 months. You only need to spend half a day to look over it, Prince. Is that too much? Who dares to make you work like a cow or horse? You're crazy." Mo Xiuyao silently cursed in his heart. He would never admit that he made Su Qingchen work like a cow or horse. He just knew how to use people. You can clearly explain these damn things in a few sentences. Is there a need for me to look for answers in this tall pile of booklets? Even if it is necessary, is it necessary to not even let me drink some water? The servant in the study is sick and has asked for leave. Is this really an idiotic reason that young Master Qingchen came up with? Can't I read it tomorrow? Mo Xiuyao asked without much hope. Su Qingchen smiled and said, "Of course you can. Prince will be in charge of these things from tomorrow onwards. But I remember that there are other things that Prince needs to look over tomorrow. Are you going to postpone it to the day after tomorrow? There are also some military affairs related to the West Hill and the northern tribes. Is it really okay?" Of course not. Mo Xiuyao gritted his teeth with hatred. It was definitely a wrong decision to let Su Qingchen manage the Northwest affairs. How could he think that brother-in-law was easier to deal with than first uncle? How could he think that brother-in-law was more powerful? Brother-in-law was younger and could be ordered around for a few more years. At least Master Hong Yu would not be as bad as this immortal-like man in front of him. On the other side, Feng Zhiyao looked at Mo Xiuyao sympathetically. "Prince, having such a brother-in-law is retribution for enslaving good people like us for so many years, isn't it?" "Young Master Feng-san, I heard that you did something earth-shattering in the capital?" After finishing Mo Xiuyao, Su Qingchen turned around and smiled at Feng Zhiyao, who was lying on the table weakly. Feng Zhiyao's face stiffened. He could only smile bitterly. If he was only one person, then he would not think that he had done anything wrong. But this time, he had implicated the Feng family and even Prince Ding's manor. Su Qingchen looked at Feng Zhiyao and said lightly, "Well done." Chapter 635. Feng Zhiyao, who originally thought that he was going to be reprimanded by young Master Qingchen, almost dropped his jaw onto the table. He had seen with his own eyes how young Master Qingchen treated Prince. Of course, he didn't dare to expect the furious young Master Qingchen to let him off. Mo Xiuyao was even more dissatisfied. What did he do well? Su Qingchen said indifferently, the results were good. Not only did the new emperor of Dechu state lose the support of the Feng family, but it also made the court of Dechu state even more chaotic. He also brought back Feng Huiting, who could take charge of business. This result was really good. Mo Xiuyao was angry. Wasn't this good result achieved by Ai's efforts? How could Feng San achieve such a result by himself? Why was it that he was the one who was scolded, and Feng Xiao, the troublemaker, was praised? Where was justice? Where was justice? Li, your brother bullied me. Mo Xiuyao reached out and hugged Yi Li's waist as he complained. Yi Li patted his shoulder with pity, saying, if my brother wants to bully you, I can't do anything about it. I don't dare to go against my brother. Su Qingqian turned back and glanced at a certain someone who was acting spoiled with Yi Li upstairs. If Prince still plans to eat dinner, it's best not to waste time. The documents on the table are still staring at Prince. Mo Xiuyao let go of Yi Li with resentment, picked up the file and flipped through it. Su Qingqian, do you really not have a wife who is secretly in love with I when you're always looking for trouble? The study maintained its silence for a while. Seeing Mo Xiuyao looking at her pitifully, Yi Li could only soften and sit down to look at the high stack of files for him. What is Enchanting trying to do? Feng Xiao raised the file in his hand and asked, in a short month, he has sent hundreds of thousands of troops to the border. As a result, the troops on the border of Xiling have reached more than 600,000. He wouldn't want to attack us, would he? Mo Xiuyao tilted his head and rubbed his chin. That shouldn't be. Enchanting doesn't seem like an impulsive person. Also, if he wanted to send troops to the northwest, he would have done it when I and Li weren't here. He wouldn't have delayed until now. Feng Xiao was confused. Then what does he want to do? Is he bored to provoke us? Yi Li pondered for a moment and said, if he doesn't want to fight us, then he wants to fight someone else. War is a matter of state. Enchanting won't rashly mobilize hundreds of thousands of troops just to play with us. I didn't expect him to attack to go to the border to she to attack to the to be to attack to go back. Su Qingqian felt somewhat regretful. Then, he said with some relief, I indeed miscalculated this time. The southern border is a remote place. The border with Xiling is even more dangerous. In most cases, Nanzhao is unable to pose an effective threat to Xiling. At the same time, Xiling would have to expend a lot of effort to take Nanzhao. Enchanting has always been wary of us. It is possible that he has temporarily given up on Nanzhao. Mo Xiuyao turned to look at the map hanging on the wall and said, he still wants to attack the Dechu state. Feng Xiao smiled and said, that is possible. Compared to us, the northwest is considered barren. After all, Dechu state's Jiangnan and Chu capital are the truly prosperous places. Right now, Dechu state has a new emperor and is at war with the north. In the north, the northern tribes are eyeing us. It would be strange if he didn't want a share. So, the hundreds of thousands of soldiers on the border are prepared to prevent us from sending troops to help Dechu state? He really thinks highly of the Mahist army. I fear that if he truly sends troops to attack the Dechu state, he will not have much more than this. Su Qingqian looked calmly at Mo Xiuyao. What are Prince's plans? Mo Xiuyao raised his eyebrows and looked in puzzlement at the white-clothed man sitting leisurely in front of him. Su Qingqian smiled faintly and said, once Xiling attacks Dechu, the northern tribes in the north will definitely take the opportunity to attack as well. Does your highness intend to help or do you intend to ignore it? Mo Xiuyao raised his eyebrows and said, what if I help? What if I ignore it? If I help, it means that Prince acknowledges Mo Jingqi's last edict. The Mahist army will still be Dechu state's guards, the Prince Ding mansion will still be Dechu state's subject, and the northwest will still be Dechu state's land. If I ignore it, no one will dare to provoke me in the northwest in the short term. But once Dechu state is annexed, Xiling and the northern tribes and Dechu will attack. The West Hill and the northern tribes will form an encirclement around the northwest. At that time, Su Qingqian's voice was calm, as if he was not talking about the fate of the northwest and the Mo army, but about what to eat for breakfast the next morning. Mo Xiuyao propped up his head and looked at Su Qingqian for a long time before turning to smile at Yi Li. He opened his mouth and said, I choose neither. Su Qingqian raised his eyebrows. Mo Xiuyao smiled coldly. The brush in his hand flew out and with a whoosh, nailed into the map on the wall. Everyone looked up and saw that the brush was 2 inches deep into the wall. Its position was exactly where Lu City, the capital of West Hill, was on the map. Mo Xiuyao said calmly, I choose to attack West Hill. Feng Xiao's eyes lit up. He stared fixedly at the brush that was nailed to the map. It was as if that small brush was a sharp sword that could split the capital of West Hill. Enter the palace. West Hill. Prince, are you serious? Feng Xiao's voice trembled. It was obvious that he was excited. Do you think I can joke around? Mo Xiaoyao laughed. Feng Jiao's eyes lit up even more. The Mahist army had been dormant for many years. It was finally time for them to show their prowess. This was Dechu State's most elite army. In fact, when they were first established in the city, their original goal was to unify the world. However, due to various reasons, this goal could not be realized. In the blink of an eye, almost 200 years had passed. The Mahist army's prowess and glory had almost been worn out. Now, was it finally time for them, if that's the case? Su Qingchen smiled faintly. His voice was clear and calm. Is Prince ready? If I's not ready, won't the 300,000 soldiers that Prince Qingchen sent to the border be wasted? Mo Xiaoyao laughed loudly. Su Qingchen did not mind that Mo Xiaoyao had exposed his plan. He smiled and said, if that's the case, congratulations to Prince for your victory. In the originally calm and ordinary study, what seemed to be a casual conversation was definitely a reflection of the future of the world. Yili sat at the side with a faint smile. The world was going to be in chaos. As his wife, she would always be by his side. As Ding Wangfei, she would personally participate in this game of vying for the throne. Chapter 636. At the end of the 5th month of this year, the new emperor of Dechu State had ascended the throne for less than 2 months. Most of the power in the court was in the hands of the regent. But the undercurrents in the court did not stop. King Li's intentions were too obvious. The officials in the court who supported Jingxua slowly gathered together and formed a secret balance with the regent. On the northern border, the battle in front of Zijing Pass was still ongoing. Even further north, the northern tribe's army had begun to move before the beginning of summer. On the 20th of the 5th month, the Xiling army once again launched an attack on the southwest border. The people of the southwest who had just experienced a few years of war were once again caught in the flames of war. Northwestly city on a mountain not far from the city, Lishan Academy was hidden in the lush forest. It was still quiet and elegant as though it was an otherworldly place. Yili passed through the quiet bamboo forest and headed towards the place where the sound of the guqin was coming from. In an empty space in the bamboo forest, the white-haired Master Qingyun sat on the ground with a wooden guqin on his lap. He lightly plucked the strings and played. Su Jie, whose hair and beard had turned white, was sitting not far away from him. He was listening to the music of the guqin while leisurely making tea. Lear has come? Master Qingyun stopped playing and turned to look at Yi Li with a faint smile. Grandfather, Elder Su, Yi Li said softly. She walked forward and helped Master Qingyun sit down on the stone bench in front of Su Jie. Su Jie smiled and poured a cup of tea for each of them. He said with a smile, "Why has Wang Fei come at this time? Have you come to see little Shitzi?" Yi Li said with a smile, "Xiao Bao has grandfather and Elder Su teaching him. I am very assured. Those children didn't disturb grandfather and Elder Su, right?" Now, there were not only students in Lishan Academy, there were also 3 children. Mo Xiao Bao was going to Lishan Academy to study. Lang Junhan was still young but could only follow. As such, Qingjing sent her own Su Jirue over, saying that the 3 children could be companions. The little heir is even more intelligent than the prince back in the day. What is there to worry about? Su Jie said with a smile. When he mentioned Mo Xiaobao, his eyes were filled with affection. He had always liked Mo Xiaobao's intelligence. Mo Xiaobao was also as respectful and courteous to this eunuch Su. Naturally, this caused Elder Su, who had no children, to dote on him even more. Sometimes, even Mr. Qingyun had to take a back seat. It had to be said that even though Mo Xiaobao was young, when it came to flattery, many adults were left in the dust. Mr. Qingyun looked at Yi Li with a gentle and kind expression. "Li are you going on a long journey?" Yi Li looked at Master Qingyun in surprise. Grandfather is in Lishan Academy but he is not oblivious to the outside world. You actually know the current affairs of the world so well. Su Jie shook his head and said with a smile, Mr. Qingyun is not known for his literary talent, but he does not know anything about astronomy, geography, astrology, and medicine. This morning, he told me that the prince and Wang Fei have moved and will likely be on a long journey in the near future. Isn't Princess Consort here now? This works? Yi Li had heard of the so-called astrology, but she had not studied it at all. Because the traces of her previous life were still engraved in her bones, she even had some doubts about this. Then, what else can grandfather see? Mr. Qingyun stroked his snow-white beard and shook his head with a sigh. The world is in chaos. Such chaos is rare to see in hundreds of years. Hearing Mr. Qingyun's words, not just Yi Li, even Su Jie's expression became grave. Su Jie asked regretfully, is there really no way to reverse it? Mr. Qingyun shook his head and said, this chaos has been buried many years ago. There is no turning back. Lier, in this generation of the Su family, you and your older brother are the most outstanding. Especially you. Fighting for the world, death and injury are hard to avoid, but the common people are innocent. No matter what, do not ignite anger on the innocent common people. You and Prince Ding must be careful. Yili nodded and said softly, Grandfather, please do not worry. Xiaoyao is not this kind of person. Yili understood what Mr. Qingyun meant. In this era, there was no such thing as human rights. The common people were as lowly as grass. In the history of the dynasties, there were countless records of massacres. Even if the rulers covered it up, the later generations could still see some traces. However, Yili did not think that she would do this. Whether it was basic human nature or her identity as a soldier, it would not allow her to do this kind of thing. She also believed that Mo Xiaoyao would also not do this kind of thing. Looking at the gentle and serious girl in front of him, Mr. Qingyun's wrinkled face showed a trace of a sigh. His eyes that were filled with wisdom flashed with a trace of worry. He sighed softly, It's fine. We are all old. The future will depend on you young people. When you go out, be careful. Yili nodded and said with a smile, Grandfather, please do not worry. It's just that after we leave, only Big Brother will be left in Glass City. Grandfather, please talk to Big Uncle and Second Uncle. I'm afraid Big Brother won't be able to handle it alone. Second Uncle Su Hongyan came to Lishan Academy to teach early. Although Big Uncle was still in Glass City, he seemed to be interested in agriculture. In the past year, he had gone to Fourth Brother and Fifth Brother's place several times. Although this was a very important matter, it was a bit of a waste to leave it to Su Hongyu. Mr. Qingyun stroked his beard and said with a smile, They were idle before because they had nothing to do. Now that they have something to do, they will naturally go back. Is there a need for me to say anything? Yili blinked and came to a realization, Thank you grandfather for your guidance. Lier understands. Mr. Qingyun nodded and said with a smile, Grandfather knows that you are very busy. You don't have to stay in front of us old men. Go. Yili then stood up and bid farewell to Mr. Qingyun and Suzha. Looking at the graceful figure that was gradually disappearing, Suzha shook his head and said to Mr. Qingyun, Princess Ding is really going to go to war with Prince Ding? Can Mr. Qingyun be at ease? Mr. Qingyun shook his head and sighed, the child has grown up. Lier was still a little girl that was younger than Chen Er. Suzha had seen Yili when she was young. At that time, the Su family was still in the Chu capital and Yili's birth mother had not passed away. At that time, she was just a little girl. Who would have thought that she would grow up to be the Princess Ding who could rule the country and bring peace to the country? Mr. Qingyun frowned and said, I see that Prince Ding's anger hasn't dissipated. I'm afraid that in the future, he will be too bloodthirsty. With Lier, we can persuade him. It's more important. How can it be? Suzha frowned and said. In the past few years, although he didn't see Mo Xiaoyao many times, he still did it a few times. Although he had white hair, Mo Xiaoyao's temper was much better than when he was young. Usually, he didn't seem to have any anger in his heart. Mr. Qingyun shook his head and said, We all know what kind of temper Prince Ding had when he was young. But now, his temper, it makes people uneasy. With his original temper, how do you think he will treat Mo Jingqi? Suzha pondered for a moment and couldn't help but change his expression, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, I'm afraid it will be 10 times worse. But after so many years, Prince Ding's temper has been smoothed out. Mr. Qingyun smiled faintly and said, The temper of the Mo family is the same. How can it be so easy to polish it out? The regent at that time was the best-tempered prince in the Prince Ding mansion, right? Do you think the late emperor could bear the blow before he died? Chapter 637. Suzha was speechless. The regent that Mr. Qingyun was referring to was naturally Mo Xiaoyao's father, Mo Lufang. Even though decades had passed, Suzha could still remember that handsome, elegant, and peerless man in embroidered robes. Even though he was as capable as the previous Prince Ding, Mo Lufang was the epitome of elegance. In this world, only Mr. Qingchen could compete with him. But Mr. Qingchen's appearance and temperament were too elegant, more like an immortal. But Mo Lufang was the true elegance and elegance of the mortal world. He was a noble son from a famous family. That kind of talent and grace should be immortalized for generations. But such a person was schemed against by the emperor that he sincerely assisted. The counterattack that he left behind before his death was enough to be enjoyed. The previous emperor, who was in his prime, passed away in less than 3 years. His ambition was only given to the cold imperial cemetery. Leaving behind the new emperor, Mo Jingqi, who was in his teens, also bought a few years of buffer time for the Prince Ding mansion. Otherwise, the brothers Mo Xiaowen and Mo Xiaoyao, who were similarly young, would have fallen into the hands of the previous emperor. The Prince Ding mansion might not even exist now. If that's the case? Suja muttered to himself. Mr. Qingyun said in a low voice, Prince Ding has been suppressing himself all these years. Or rather, he has been playing a game of chess in his heart. So he could suppress his hatred towards Mo Jingqi and the royal family of Dechu state. Even the hatred towards the northern tribes and the western mausoleum. Even though he seemed to have no scruples these years, in reality, he was still suppressing himself. He needed time to plan, and now, this plan is clearly ripe. And the battlefield is often the easiest place to trigger the true side of a person's heart. Once these years of suppressing himself explode, in this world, other than Li no one can stop him. Back then, Mo Jingqi was not the only one involved in the Prince Ding mansion incident. The northern tribes and the western mausoleum were more or less involved. Furthermore, the Mahist army had died under the hands of the northern tribes. For so many years, whenever Master Qingyun thought of Mo Xiaoyao's calmness as an envoy from the northern tribes, he would tremble in fear. So that's how it is. Suja sighed, a trace of guilt appearing on his face. If Su Zuidi had not stolen the map of the Mahist army back then, the incident back then might not have happened at all. No matter how much he felt sorry for his only granddaughter, Suja felt that he didn't even have the right to feel sorry for the tens of thousands of heroes of the Mahist army who had died unjustly. Who would feel sorry for those soldiers who fought for the country but died without knowing why? All of this was because there was no harm in him teaching. There was no harm in teaching. Seeing Suja's expression, Mr. Qingyun knew what he was thinking. She patted his hand and said, "Those things are in the past. Why think about it?" Suja shook his head and sighed at the sky. After bidding farewell to Mr. Qingyun, she went to visit Mo Xiaobao and Yi Li before returning to the Prince Ding mansion. When she came in, she saw the officials and generals who usually didn't appear at the Prince Ding mansion waiting in the garden. Seeing Yi Li come in, they immediately came forward to bow. Yi Li raised an eyebrow and said with a smile, "What is everyone doing? Did something happen in the Wang Fu at this time?" Zhang Qilan said with a smile, "Wang Fei, don't worry. We have done everything the prince and Wang Fei ordered. What is the matter?" Yi Li said with a smile, "It's nothing. Did you all come just to pay your respects? Our Wang Fu doesn't have so many formalities. Since there's nothing else, please go back." Wang Fei. The others didn't dare to say anything, but Lu Jingxian, Zhang Qilan, and Yuan Pei, these old generals didn't have such concerns. They hurriedly stopped Yi Li. Yi Li raised an eyebrow and looked at them with a smile. Lu Jingxian was pushed out and said, "This?" Wang Fei, just now, the envoys from Xiling and Dechu state asked to see the prince at the same time. We just want to ask, what is the prince's intention? These days, they had been secretly preparing their troops. It looked like they were going to make a move. This made these old generals who had been waiting for so long that their bones were stiff secretly excited. But today, they had suddenly come for two countries at the same time. Which side the prince was leaning towards would indicate their future actions. The envoys from Xiling and Dechu state asked for an audience at the same time? Yi Li raised an eyebrow. She had just come back and didn't know this news. Lin Han, who was following beside her, rubbed his nose and said, "This subordinate was just about to report this matter to Wang Fei. The envoys from Xiling came first, and the envoys from Dechu state arrived later. But the prince first summoned the envoys from Dechu state. In addition, the prince asked Wang Fei to come to the main hall when she returned." Yi Li smiled but didn't say anything. She smiled as she looked at the people surrounding her. Everyone hurriedly retreated. "Wang Fei, please. Then, this consort will leave first? We don't dare to delay Wang Fei. Wang Fei, please." It turned out that Wang Fei didn't know either. Everyone sighed helplessly. They could only watch as Yi Li left, eagerly waiting for the results. In a corner, Feng Huiting and Han Mingyue were sitting and playing chess. Han Mingxi had hung himself on a tree above their heads, yawning as he watched the game. "Does young Master Mingyu think they can fight?" Feng Huiting asked lightly. Although he had only been in the Northwest for less than 3 months, the Northwest gave Feng Huiting a completely different feeling. The officials and generals of the Prince Ding mansion were all young, and Feng Huiting could be considered the oldest among them. Moreover, Master Prince Ding had given him authority and trust that he had never thought of before. Feng Huiting had once asked Mo Xiaoyao why he trusted him so much, but Prince Ding had only smiled at him half-truthfully. He didn't trust him, he only trusted Feng Zhiyao. If he betrayed the Prince Ding mansion, Feng Zhiyao's head would immediately fall to the ground. At that time, Feng Zhiyao was also present. When he heard Mo Xiaoyao's words, he didn't show any displeasure at Mo Xiaoyao's words, as if it was how it should be. Feng Huiting didn't understand the friendship between these young people, but as the head of the Feng clan, he knew what choice was. Although the Prince Ding mansion didn't seem to have the upper hand in the world, he didn't know why, but he believed that if there was only one winner in the world, it would definitely be Prince Ding. And the Feng clan would naturally choose the winner in the end. Naturally, after so many years. Even if the Mahist army doesn't want to move, others can't help it. Han Mingyue said lightly. These few years of idleness at home, no one in Glass City targeted him, and no one did anything to him. But at the same time, no one needed him to do anything, because he knew that Mo Xiaoyao no longer trusted him. After so many years, he gradually woke up from the dream of Suzuity, and realized what he had lost for his so-called love. But it was already too late. Han Mingyue wouldn't embarrass himself by doing something to redeem their friendship. He understood Mo Xiaoyao. Once Mo Xiaoyao gave his friendship, as long as you didn't betray him, he wouldn't give you up. But once you betrayed him, it would be an eternal break. From the time he took the first step for Suzuity, there was already no room for redemption between them. So he just followed his younger brother like an idler, occasionally giving him a few pointers when he needed. Now, this younger brother was his only family in this world. Chapter 638. Han Mingxi hung himself on the tree like a bat and lazily said, "What does fighting have to do with us? They didn't need to go to the battlefield." Feng Huiting put down the chess piece and stood up with a smile. "Of course it has something to do with us. Since that's the case, we should prepare." Han Mingxi fell from the tree and looked at Feng Huiting's departing figure. He suspiciously asked, "What should we prepare?" Han Mingyue smiled faintly and said, "Before the troops and horses move, the provisions will move first. The head of the Feng family is a smart person." "Brother." Han Mingxi looked at his elder brother with some regret and worry. In the past, his elder brother was immersed in the matter of Suzuity. Now, he had gradually come to his senses. His elder brother's talent was definitely not inferior to the head of the Feng family. However, what happened in the past determined that he would never be able to use his talents in the Northwest. Han Mingyue shook her head in relief and smiled faintly. "Ming, to me, the so-called imperial ambitions are just a dream. No, I haven't even had such a dream. There's nothing wrong with being like this. Prince Ding really doesn't know that you've been giving me ideas behind my back for the past 2 years?" Han Mingxi asked. His talent was limited and he was never afraid to admit that he was inferior to others. In the past 2 years, Prince Ding had given him many things that were clearly beyond his ability. This made Han Mingxi have some doubts. Han Mingxi smiled and patted his younger brother's shoulder. "It's rare for you to be confused. Let's go. Mr. Feng might have something that he needs your help with." When Yili stepped into the reception hall, the envoy from Dechu State had not yet left. The envoy from Xiling was arranged to drink tea and wait in the reception hall on the other side. When she walked in and saw the envoy from Dechu State, Yili was stunned. So he could be considered an acquaintance. "King Yu, Mo Jingyu. Lili, you're back." Seeing Yili appear at the door, Mo Xiaoyao, who originally had a trace of impatience on his face, immediately smiled and stood up to welcome Yili. Mo Jingyu also hurriedly stood up and bowed. "Princess Ding. What is Princess Consort doing?" Yili smiled faintly and said, "So it's King Yu. I just left the city to visit my grandfather. King Yu has come to greet me, please forgive me." Of course, Mo Jingyu knew about Lishan Academy on a mountain not far from the city. It was originally Dechu State's Lishan Academy, one of the 3 great academies in the world. And because of Mo Jingqi's stupidity, the Northwest had taken advantage of him. In the past 2 years, the talent selection system in the Northwest had basically taken shape. The biggest factor was that Lishan Academy had attracted and nurtured an endless stream of talents. Many students who traveled thousands of miles to study would choose to stay in the Northwest after they finished their studies. Moreover, the number of students from the Northwestern region had increased greatly in the past 2 years. They were even more loyal to the Prince Ding mansion. "King Yu, please take a seat." Following Mo Xiaoyao to the main seat, Yili said with a smile. Mo Xiaoyao thanked him and sat down again. Looking at Mo Xiaoyao, who was clearly no longer paying attention to him, he could not help but smile bitterly, not knowing what to say. Yili said somewhat apologetically, "Did I interrupt your conversation?" Mo Xiaoyao pulled one of Yili's hands over his knee and played with it as he said, "What's the matter? Have you come to ask for help?" "Ask for help?" Yili raised an eyebrow. Mo Xiaoyao smiled bitterly. For the sake of Mo Xiaoyao, he had spoken directly. He did come to ask for help, but for Mo Xiaoyao to say it in such a tone, it made him feel a little awkward. Yili frowned and said, "Has the situation already deteriorated to this extent? King Li actually agreed to ask for help from the Mahist army?" Mo Jingyu was somewhat embarrassed. King Li had indeed not agreed. It had to be said that even if Mo Jingli and Mo Jingqi did not get along, they were still brothers. On the issue of the Prince Ding mansion, they were truly unprincipled. The only difference was that Mo Jingqi was targeting the Prince Ding mansion. No matter who the Prince Ding was, he could not wait to pounce on them and bite them. As for Mo Jingli, he was more targeting Mo Xiaoyao as a person. But the current situation did not allow Mo Jingli to disagree. Perhaps Mo Jingli could bring his own people and retreat to Jiangnan. But the others could not. Their roots were in the Chu capital. Once the Chu capital was broken, everything would be over for them. General Leng is currently resisting the north at Zijing Pass. Last month, Xiling and the northern tribes simultaneously launched an attack on the Dechu state. Dechu state is being attacked from 3 sides. It is truly. I hope that Prince Ding will give us a helping hand on behalf of the Dechu state. Mo Xiaoyao sneered. Give us a helping hand? This is the meaning of those old men in the imperial court, right? Did Mo Jingli agree? Does King Yu dare to guarantee that Mo Jingli will not stab a knife in the back when I send troops? My Mahist army has experienced this kind of thing more than once or twice in the Mahist army. King Yu, please return. Prince Ding. Are you really going to watch us die? Although he was close to Mo Jingli, he did not want to see the Dechu state destroyed. Could it be that Prince Ding feels that our sincerity is not enough? If there is anything else we can do, Prince Ding, please do not hesitate to speak. Sincerity. Mo Xiaoyao said indifferently, from beginning to end, I have not seen any sincerity. However, it's not impossible. Mo Jingyu was overjoyed. Prince Ding, please instruct me. Mo Xiaoyao's lips curved into a cold smile. As long as Mo Jingli is willing to kneel in front of the Mahist army and apologize for the Dechu state's royal family, I can consider it. Mo Jingyu's expression changed. He immediately understood that he had come in vain. Let alone having Mo Jingli kneel in front of the Mahist army, he was afraid that he would not even be able to bow to Mo Xiaoyao. Sighing helplessly, Mo Jingyu finally lowered his head in dejection. Mo Xiaoyao smiled. It seems that King Yu has given up. Then please. Mo Jingyu looked at the indifferent Mo Xiaoyao. Finally, he sighed and stood up to leave. Chapter 639. After sending Mo Jingyu away, Mo Xiaoyao was obviously in a good mood. He pulled Yi Li into his arms and sighed with satisfaction. Li, what do you think those old men are thinking? They know I won't agree, but they still sent people to persuade me? Yi Li leaned in his arms and smiled. Why do they know you won't agree? I feel that they originally thought that the possibility of you agreeing was very high. After all, the concept of Prince Ding Fu being loyal to Great Chu for over 100 years was deeply ingrained in everyone's hearts. Although Mo Xiaoyao had already stated clearly that he would cut ties with the Dechu state, many old officials thought it was a misunderstanding after Mo Jingqi issued an edict of self-guilt. Now that the truth was out, the Prince Ding mansion was naturally still the Prince Ding mansion that guarded the Dechu state. But they never thought that Mo Jingqi could apologize in front of the world, but no one said that the Prince Ding mansion and the Mahist army had to accept it and choose to forgive it. From this point of view, perhaps Mo Jingli saw things more clearly. At least Mo Jingli would never beg Mo Xiaoyao, whether it was because he knew Mo Xiaoyao would not agree or for his own dignity. Mo Xiaoyao snorted and smiled faintly. Fine, let's make them give up completely this time. Yi Li raised her head. A messenger from the West Hill? Mo Xiaoyao said carelessly. Let him wait a little longer. He is also an acquaintance of ours. Lei Tingfeng? Yi Li only needed to think for a moment to understand the identity of the visitor. If he wanted to negotiate with Mo Xiaoyao, Genom of Gojoseon would not send a random person. Although the Jinan Palace was in charge of the West Hill now, Lei Jinting and his son were still very wary of the Emperor of Xiling's people. Therefore, only Lei Tingfeng could be trusted and had the ability to do so. Yi Li asked curiously, how do you plan to restore Lei Tingfeng? Mo Xiaoyao raised his eyebrows and smiled. Why should I reply to him? Yi Li blinked. Doesn't Prince Ding want to know what conditions Genom of Gojoseon offered? Mo Xiaoyao's lips curved into a faint smile, a cold light flashing through his eyes. No matter what conditions he offers, Lei Jinting will regret it. After drinking half a cup of tea, the two leaned against each other and chatted for a while before ordering someone to invite Lei Tingfeng over. Lei Tingfeng arrived before Mo Jingyu. Although Mo Jingyu arrived almost immediately, Mo Xiaoyao chose to see Mo Jingyu first. This made Lei Tingfeng's confidence in the negotiation somewhat waver. To make matters worse, after Mo Jingyu left, Mo Xiaoyao did not immediately receive him. Instead, he made him wait for about an hour. This kind of treatment made him feel even less inferior. However, these years of experience were not in vain. Lei Tingfeng was never an impulsive person. Therefore, when Zhuojing was ordered to invite him over, he sat calmly and drank tea. Greetings to Prince Ding, greetings to Princess Consort. Since we parted last year in West Hill, the two of you are even more elegant than before. Looking at the two people sitting side by side on the main seat, Lei Tingfeng could not help but sigh in his heart. These two people? Just based on Prince Ding's devotion to Princess Ding all these years, it was enough to make others envious. Of course, if one could have a wife like Princess Ding, he believed that anyone would be willing to be devoted to her. Although Lei Tingfeng had countless concubines in his residence, seeing the two of them always walking side by side and supporting each other, he could not help but feel envious. Yi Li smiled and said, Genom of Gojoseon, please sit. It seems that after we parted last year, you are still as elegant as before. Right, I have not congratulated you on being conferred the title of Commandery King. In the future, you should be called Commandery King Rue, right? Lei Tingfeng's heart stilled. The fact that he had been conferred the title of Commandery King had only happened after West Hill had sent out troops, and it had not been widely publicized. He had not expected Yi Li to already know. As expected, Princess Ding's information channels could not be underestimated. Even though he was shocked inside, Lei Tingfeng's expression was calm. He smiled faintly and said, I am ashamed, Princess Consort is too serious. Then, why has Prince Rue come so far? Yi Li asked. Lei Tingfeng glanced at the white-haired man sitting at the side and smiling at Yi Li. Clearly, Mo Xiaoyao did not intend to speak. It was as though he had given the entire matter to Princess Consort to handle. Even though he knew that Princess Ding's status in the Prince Ding mansion could be said to be the highest among all the princesses in history. But Lei Tingfeng was still shocked that Mo Xiaoyao would give such an important matter to her to handle. Meeting Yi Li's calm and graceful gaze, Lei Tingfeng gathered his thoughts and said seriously, the Prince Ding mansion is well informed. I presume that Prince Ding and Princess Consort already know that West Hill has sent troops to the Dechu state? Yi Li nodded and smiled without speaking. Lei Tingfeng sighed inside and said, I presume that Prince Ding and Princess Consort have already seen the state of the world. I do not dare to show my slight skill in front of an expert. Right now, Dechu state has the Northern Territory and Northern tribes to the north, West Hill to the west, and even pirates to the east. Even though Dechu state has a large population and soldiers, but no generals, it may not be able to defeat the combined attack of three countries. I have come on my father's orders to consult His Highness Prince Ding. Regarding this battle, what plans does Prince Ding have? Mo Xiaoyao turned his head and glanced coolly at him. This glance made Lei Tingfeng feel like an idiot. Of course, he knew that Mo Xiaoyao would not tell him what plans the Mahist army had. But facing these two stubborn people, he had to start with a topic, right? Facing these two people, the best way to deal with them was undoubtedly to be straightforward. Yi Li pretended not to see Lei Tingfeng's awkwardness and said with a smile, what does Genom of Gojoseon mean? This battle, what if the Prince Ding mansion intervenes? What if they don't? Lei Tingfeng said, the Prince Ding mansion and the Dechu state have already broken off all ties. My father believes that Prince Ding is a man of his words. If the Mahist army is willing to share the Dechu state with the three countries, that would be the best. Everyone will rely on their own abilities. If Prince Ding does not move and takes the Dechu state, West Hill is willing to give you 2 prefectures near the northwest as a gift. Genom of Gojoseon is very generous. Yi Li praised with a smile. There were only 4 prefectures and 13 cities in the northwest. Genom of Gojoseon offered 2 prefectures, which was equivalent to half the area of the northwest. Moreover, he did not need the Mahist army to send a single soldier. If this was a normal business deal, this would definitely be a profitable one. Lei Tingfeng said with a smile, this can be considered my father and West Hill's sincerity. As long as the Mahist army does not help the Dechu state, everything can be discussed. In addition, West Hill and the Northwest can sign an agreement that both sides will live in peace forever. What does Wang Fei think? Yi Li frowned and thought for a moment. She smiled faintly and said, Rue Wang's conditions are indeed very tempting, but I'm afraid I can't make a decision in such a short time. Yi Li looked helplessly at Mo Xiaoyao, who was sleeping on her lap, and signaled to Lei Tingfeng. If Prince Ding did not want to work, no one could do anything about it. Lei Tingfeng could only smile bitterly. Of course, he understood that it was not that Yi Li could not make a decision in such a short time, but that the bargaining chips they offered were not enough. Gritting his teeth, Lei Tingfeng said, this one remembers that many of the Northwest's minerals are purchased from other countries. Most of them are from West Hill. As long as Prince Ding agrees not to interfere in this matter, all payments before this year will be waived. Chapter 640. Seeing the sleeping Mo Xiaoyao turn his head and raise his eyebrows but still not open his eyes, Lei Tingfeng's face almost turned green. He gritted his teeth and said, "There is a mine at the border between Xiling and the northwest and the northern tribes. It belongs to Xiling henceforth, it will be given to the Prince Ding mansion." It was not that Lei Tingfeng was unwilling to give up the mine. After all, since it was included in the original conditions, it was not something that could not be given up. Also, that mine was at the border between the northwest of Xiling and the northern tribes. It was often harassed by the northern tribes. It was impossible to mine in peace. The amount of ore produced each year was not even a fraction of Xiling's total. Once Xiling took over the Dechu state, even if it was not all of it, Xiling had the geographical advantage and did not need to fight with the northern tribes in the north. As long as it was not in the south, the wealthiest places in the Dechu state would belong to Xiling. With such great benefits, they would be willing to give up 3 or 5 mines, not to mention 1 mine. But the conditions he gave now were the bottom line he could give. After all, Mo Xiuyao did not need to do anything to get so many benefits. If there were more, it would not be up to him to decide. Yi Li's eyes flashed slightly. She smiled slightly and said, "Rui King is indeed very generous. If that is the case, this consort and the prince need to consider carefully." Lei Tingfeng said somewhat anxiously, "Forgive me, Wang Fei. This one really does not have time to stay in the northwest for long." Yi Li smiled and said, "Rui King, do not worry. I will give you an answer by tomorrow morning at the latest. Rui King must have had a hard time coming from afar. Shouldn't you rest for a night before continuing?" Lei Tingfeng hesitated for a moment before nodding his head. He had rushed to Xiling on horseback because he was afraid that the Dechu state would be ahead of him. He was indeed tired. "If that is the case, then many thanks, Wang Fei." Yi Li nodded and smiled. She summoned Zhuojing, who was waiting outside, and said, "Send Rui King to the embassy to rest." Hearing this, Lei Tingfeng secretly heaved a sigh of relief. If Yi Li had asked him to rest in the Prince Ding mansion, he would have been worried. After thanking Yi Li again, Lei Tingfeng left with Zhuojing. The hall was silent. Yi Li leaned back in her chair and looked down at Mo Xiuyao, who was still resting on her lap with his eyes closed. She laughed softly and said, "It looks like Lei Zhenting is determined to take over the Dechu state." Mo Xiuyao said lightly, "Lei Zhenting is almost 60 years old." Yi Li was slightly embarrassed. Although Lei Zhenting was over 50 years old, he was still a distance away from 60, right? However, this didn't stop her from understanding Mo Xiuyao's intentions. Lei Zhenting was already old. Although his martial arts were also peerless, no one could be sure that he would live to Murong Xiong's age. Moreover, even if he could live to Murong Xiong's age, Mo Xiuyao was still too young compared to him. Especially after taking the antidote made from the biluo flower, Mo Xiuyao's old injuries had all healed. Even his appearance hadn't changed much. After these few years, Mo Xiuyao, who was over 30 years old, still looked like a young man of 26 or 27 years old. At least for the next 20 years, Mo Xiuyao would be at his peak, while Lei Zhenting would only get older and older. To put it bluntly, even if Mo Xiuyao was exhausted, he could still exhaust Lei Zhenting to death. However, Lei Zhenting's pride wouldn't allow him to successively lose to the Mo father and son, so he couldn't do nothing. Since he couldn't touch Mo Xiuyao for the time being, then he could only strengthen Xiling, and then deal with Mo Xiuyao. The fastest way to strengthen Xiling was to obtain the vast and prosperous Dechu state. This was why he gave up Nanjiao and attacked Dechu state. "You said? Lei Zhenting knew of your plans in the end? Would he die of anger?" Thinking of a certain person's evil intentions, Yi Li couldn't help but ask with a smile. No, Lei Zhenting wouldn't die so easily. Even if he were to die. The person resting with his eyes closed said lazily, he would still die on the battlefield. Die at Ai's hands. Shaking her head, Yi Li sighed and said, "War brings disaster, I don't know the people of this world." Yi Li couldn't help but admit that she still felt a trace of apprehension. She had never seen a real war. Even when Xinyang was massacred by Xiling a few years ago, that was only a small-scale war. But in front of her eyes, she could almost see the world in chaos and the people living in poverty. Mo Xiuyao groped for her hand. "Li, don't be afraid," Yi Li smiled and said, Don't be afraid. No matter what, I will accompany you." The next morning, Lei Tingfeng left Xiling satisfied with Mo Xiuyao's promise and personally signed agreement. Once the Northwest decided to stand by and do nothing, one could almost imagine the Dechu state's imminent destruction. In order to ensure that Xiling's efforts were rewarded, Lei Tingfeng couldn't wait to announce this news to the world as soon as he left Glass City. This news was definitely good news to the armies of various countries that were fighting Dechu state, but to the Dechu state that was struggling to resist, it was no different from adding fuel to the fire. When the news spread all over the world, All the nobles and nobles of various countries clapped their hands in celebration, rubbing their fists and staring covetously at the huge empire that was on the verge of collapse not far away. However, countless officials and common people of Great Chu could only cry out loud. In the south, at Shattered Snow Pass, Murongshan heard the news from his subordinates and only sighed. He waved his hand and dismissed them. Standing on the city tower of Shattered Snow Pass and looking towards the north, a famous general could almost see the entire Dechu state slowly collapsing. But they couldn't do anything. Those who had the ability to save Dechu state had been chased out of Dechu state many years ago by the county king sitting high on the dragon throne. Dechu state had abandoned them. When Dechu state was in danger, they wouldn't support it like before. In Du Kuo's residence in the Chu capital, the white-haired Du Kuo looked at the tired Mo Jingyu and turned to leave. A trace of sorrow and helplessness appeared on his wrinkled face, but there was also some determination. Come, I want to enter the palace. After a while, Du Kuo said in a low voice. The grandson serving beside him asked worriedly, Grandfather, why do you want to enter the palace at this time? Du Kuo said in a low voice, I want to go to war. There's no one guarding the northern tribe's border. Although I'm old, I can still move. The grandson's eyes reddened. How can that be? Grandfather is so old, you should be enjoying your old age. I'll go to the palace and ask for an edict. I'm willing to help grandfather stop the northern tribe's army. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but hate himself for being weak. The Hua family was originally a family of generals, but because of the king's fear, grandfather and everyone else should be educated. Even if he wanted to go to the battlefield, what use would it be? Grandfather? Aunt and sister are in the northwest. Why don't you invite them? Nonsense. Du Kuo said sternly. They're all women. They shouldn't be involved in these things. Besides, the Prince Ding mansion has its own path to take, and the Hua family has its own path to take. Yes, I know my mistake. Forget it. Prepare to enter the palace. North of Redbud Pass and the great general's residence in Redbud Pass, Leng Huai sighed deeply as he looked at the battle report that had just been sent to the table. Leng Qingyu and Mu Yang looked over. Leng Qingyu frowned and asked, Father, what's wrong? Leng Huai closed his eyes and said in a low voice, Prince Ding has already refused to send troops to help Dechu State and agreed to Shiling's request. He won't interfere in Dechu State's affairs anymore. Although the Leng family and the Prince Ding mansion were not on the same side, Leng Huai himself had no ill intentions toward the Prince Ding mansion. It was just that their standpoints were different. But it had to be said that, like all the people of Dechu State, Leng Huai still had hope for Dechu State at this time. But now, everyone had to face reality. The Mahist army was really no longer the elite army protecting Dechu State. Chapter 641. Leng Qingyu frowned. Prince Ding actually did this. Isn't he afraid of being criticized by the people of Dechu State? Lang Haoyu, who had been whispering to Murong Ting, raised his eyebrows and sneered. Why can't Prince Ding do this? A few years ago, the Prince Ding mansion had nothing to do with the Dechu State. Why does Big Brother think that the Prince Ding mansion must send troops to help the Dechu State? The Prince Ding mansion has protected the Dechu State for hundreds of years, and no one has been grateful to them. Now that they're in trouble, they refuse to help. Is it a heinous crime? Leng Qingyu frowned and looked at Lang Haoyu unhappily. No matter what, the Mahist army is a subject of the Dechu State, and the children of the Mahist army are all citizens of the Dechu State. What's the difference between Mo Shiryao standing by and kicking someone when they're down? Besides, the late emperor has already issued an edict and restored all the glory of the Prince Ding mansion. Naturally, the Prince Ding mansion is still a subject of the Dechu State. Lang Haoyu sneered disdainfully. Who says that Prince Ding must accept the late emperor's edict? Who says that he must be forgiven after apologizing? Big Brother, if I accidentally stab you, I'm sure you'll be magnanimous enough to forgive me. Isn't that right? Seeing Lang Qingyu's livid face, Lang Haoyu shrugged and spread his hands. Look, we're brothers. Big Brother, you're not willing to forgive me, let alone Prince Ding and the late emperor. Enough. Is this the time to bicker? Leng Huai glanced at the two brothers who were always at odds with each other and said to Lang Qingyu, your second brother is right. Don't say these things in the future. Lang Qingyu's face was already ugly, and now it was even gloomier. He was not used to his father speaking up for Lang Haoyu. Ever since Lang Haoyu appeared on the battlefield with Murong Ting and saved Leng Huai, who was almost accidentally injured by arrows, his father seemed to have something more to his younger brother. In fact, although Leng Huai agreed with Lang Haoyu's point of view, it was mostly for his eldest son's sake. After all, he had experienced the Prince Ding mansion's background and Shadow Guard's abilities. Now that the late emperor was no longer around, they were no longer in opposition to the Prince Ding mansion. Since the old Prince Ding mansion, there was no need to offend him. As for his youngest son who had never raised his head, Leng Huai glanced at Lang Haoyu, who was leaning on the chair and chatting with his wife, with a trace of contemplation in his eyes. In fact, Leng Huai did care about the son of a concubine. At least, compared to Feng Huiting's indifference to Feng Xiao, he was still willing to discipline Lang Haoyu. It was just that the older Lang Haoyu got, the more mischievous he became. He ate, drank, whored, and gambled, and gradually, he was completely disappointed. Later, when Lang Haoyu suddenly said that he wanted to do business, although he was unhappy that his son wanted to do business, he did not stop him. At least compared to a hedonistic son who ate, drank, and played, being a businessman was still a serious matter. Moreover, Lang Haoyu was a concubine's son, so he could not get any title or even an official position. If he did business, at least he would not lack food and clothing. With the general's mansion as his backing, at least no one would dare to bully him. It was not until this time that Leng Huai realized that he had always misjudged his son. Leng Huai still remembered that day's battle. The attack of the northern army was unprecedentedly fierce, and the city wall was almost covered by a rain of arrows. Leng Huai, who was standing on the city wall supervising the battle, watched as a few sharp arrows shot towards him. However, his second son, who suddenly appeared on the city wall, waved his long sword and created a sword net, blocking all the arrows that were like a shower. When he came back to his senses, he was already pulled under the battlements by Murong Ting, who had caught up from behind. Just by looking at the almost airtight sword net that he casually drew his sword, Leng Huai knew that his second son's skills were definitely above his eldest son, who he had always been proud of. Thinking back to the news about the Feng family that came from the capital last month, Leng Huai had always known that Feng Xiao was Prince Ding's confidant. And his second son had always been close to Feng San. Lang Haoyu naturally sensed his father's thoughtful gaze. He threw a ruffian smile at Leng Huai indifferently and turned to continue chatting and laughing with Murong Ting. On the side, Mu Yang looked at the father and son trio and shook his head helplessly. He was the only son of Marquis Mu Yang's estate and did not have any siblings. Naturally, he could not understand the intrigue in this. Although he had always been closer to Lang Qingyu because of his identity, his relationship with Lang Haoyu wasn't bad either. Naturally, he could not say much at this time. He could only ask, "General Lang, is there any imperial decree?" Leng Huai shook his head and said indifferently, "We are guarding Bauhinia Pass, so we can't let the people of the northern border take a step into Bauhinia Pass. What imperial decree do we need?" The two young men were solemn. "General is right. Father is right." On the side, Lang Haoyu curled his lips disdainfully in an unseen place. Guarding Bauhinia Pass, that depended on whether the imperial court could persist in the rear. Otherwise, once the rear military supplies were cut off, the soldiers of Bauhinia Pass would die no matter how hard they fought. On the main seat above, Leng Huai also frowned slightly, and undetectable worry flashed in his eyes. Chapter 642. No matter how much bloodshed there was outside, the people in the northwest continued to live their lives peacefully. With the Mahist army around, they did not seem to be worried about being involved in the war. However, the number of refugees entering the northwest from Feihong Pass gradually increased. At first, the northwest was naturally willing to accept these refugees. After all, the northwest was not as big as the Dechu state, but the population was still not that large. Even if there were people moving into the northwest continuously in recent years, it still could not change the fact that the northwest had been barren and sparsely populated since ancient times. If it was in the past, no one would escape to such a place even if they were fleeing. However, after 2 consecutive wars, the Northwest had accepted many refugees. Now that the war had just begun, there would be a day when the Northwest's population would swell to the point where this land could not bear it. Just for this reason, the Mahist army urgently needed to expand their territory. It has been less than 2 months since the war between West Hill and the Dechu state, but the number of people entering the Northwest from Feihong Pass alone has reached 300,000. If the war continues, the number of refugees will only increase. If this situation continues, we will have to close Feihong Pass in 2 months at most. The Northwest cannot support so many people. In the spacious study, Zhou Yu reported respectfully with a solemn face. After a few years, Zhou Yu, who had been entrusted with an important task by Mo Xiuyao when he had just arrived in the Northwest, was now a civil official who could take charge of a department in the Prince Ding mansion. After Ruyang was renamed to Glass City, Zhou Yu continued to be the governor of Glass City. In recent years, the people in Glass City lived peacefully. The people lived and worked happily, and the foreign merchants were suffering more and more. This was all thanks to Zhou Yu's management. The others also looked serious. In just over a month, more than 300,000 people had entered Feihong Pass, not to mention the refugees from other places. The total number of refugees in the northwest was probably more than 500,000. One must know that hundreds of thousands of people could not be settled just by giving them a place to stay. They needed to eat and drink. Fortunately, it was not winter, otherwise, there would be problems such as clothing and housing. Furthermore, they could not allow a large number of them to starve to death or die of illness. Putting aside the issue of morality, if so many people were to die of illness during summer, it was very likely to cause a plague. They had no choice but to treat it with caution. If we lock the gates, it's very likely that the refugees will be angered. When that happens, Su Hongyan, who was sitting at the side, frowned. Ever since the Dechu state started the war, he and Su Hongyu, who were originally free and unfettered, returned. Although no one said it out loud, everyone knew in their hearts that Prince Ding would soon set out for battle. Mo Xiuyao leaned back in his chair, one hand supporting his forehead as he silently listened to the people below express their opinions. After they finished speaking, he asked, "Try to settle those refugees. But I don't want to see those lazy people stay in the northwest. I also don't want to see those spies with ulterior motives. This matter? Wei Lin, Mo Hua, shall I leave it to you to handle?" Wei Lin and Mo Hua stepped forward and said in unison, "Your Highness, please be at ease. This subordinate will definitely live up to your Highness' trust." Mo Xiuyao nodded and said, "I can rest assured that you'll handle things well. But, be careful. Don't cause any mass unrest. Mr. Hongyan, I'll have to trouble you to give them some pointers on this matter." Su Hongyan nodded in agreement and said, "This subordinate will do what is necessary. Prince, please be at ease." Zhou Yu frowned slightly and asked, "Prince, if the refugees continue to pour into the northwest, I'm afraid our reserves won't last until next year." Moreover, the prince was planning to set out for battle. When the army set out for battle, they couldn't be short on provisions. If they didn't take precautions early, many people in the northwest would starve to death this winter. Yi Li, who had been silent all this time, said softly, "If we use it wisely, it won't be a problem to last until next year." Fourth Young Master Su and Fifth Young Master Su's harvests in the north have been quite good these past few years. In addition, Fourth Young Master Su took the opportunity to write a letter last year to report that he had brought in a crop called sweet potato from the southwest. The yield is 3 to 5 times that of normal crops. It's suitable for satisfying hunger and can be grown in any soil. This year, we tried planting it at the beginning of spring, and the harvest was quite good. This type of sweet potato isn't picky about the soil it's planted in. It can even grow in barren land and sand. Fourth Young Master Su's intention is to take advantage of the fact that we can still open up a large amount of land and plant it for another season. This requires a large amount of manpower. Zhou Yu's face lit up when he heard this. He wasn't a cold-hearted person. If he could, he would naturally be willing to take in the refugees. He smiled and said, "So, Princess Consort's intention is for the refugees to open up the barren mountains?" Yi Li nodded. At the same time, she reminded them that they couldn't recklessly cut down the trees. The people of this era didn't pay attention to these problems and wouldn't encounter them. However, Yi Li understood that if they wantonly cut down the trees for important land, the Northwest's already bad climate would only worsen. Someone asked worriedly, "Even if we survive this year, what will happen in the future?" The Northwest was only so big, and this battle would take many years. The number of refugees would only increase, but there would always be a limit to the amount of food they could harvest. Mo Xiuyao raised his eyebrows slightly and looked at Su Qingqian's half-smiling face. There would indeed be more and more people, but the Northwest's land wouldn't always be this big. Moreover, when the refugees discovered that the Northwest's capacity to take in more people than they could handle, they would leave on their own. After the discussion, they dismissed everyone. Only Mo Xiuyao, Yi Li, Su Qingqian and Su Hongyu were left in the study. Su Hongyu looked at Mo Xiuyao and asked in a low voice, "Prince, have you already decided on the date to send out the troops?" Mo Xiuyao nodded. Although the Mahist army was secretly preparing, they couldn't delay for too long. If they delayed too long and were discovered by outsiders, they would lose the chance to launch a surprise attack against the Xiling army. "I'll have to trouble Big Brother and Uncle with the Northwest," Mo Xiuyao said in a low voice. Su Hongyu frowned slightly and looked at Yi Li. "Li is going as well?" Yi Li nodded and smiled. "Yes, I'll have to trouble Uncle." Su Hongyu looked at Yi Li with some disapproval. Although he knew that his niece's martial arts were extraordinary, she was the only child left behind by his only sister. Su Hongyu was strict with his sons and nephews, and even his grandnephews Su Jirue, and Mo Xiaobao. However, he was always worried about Yi Li. Yi Li smiled. "Uncle, you don't have to worry about Li Er." Grandfather also agreed. Hearing this, Su Hongyu was surprised. Compared to his love for Li Er, his father was no less than him. How could he agree to let Li Er go to such a dangerous battlefield? Thinking about it, although Su Hongyu couldn't understand, he knew that his father had his reasons for doing so. He only wanted to go back to the academy and ask his father about it. He didn't stop Yi Li inside. "Fine, you must be careful. Li Er knows." "Don't worry, uncle." Yi Li smiled. Su Qingchen thought for a moment and raised his head to ask, "The Northwest has no more than 1.2 million soldiers and horses. At least half of them need to be stationed in the Northwest. That is to say, you can only take 600,000 soldiers to battle. We have secretly investigated in the past few years. The total number of soldiers in West Hill has exceeded 3 million. Enchanting has invested close to 1 million soldiers into Chu State. Once you go deep into West Hill, he will come back to rescue you and surround you from all sides. You will be surrounded by at least 2 million soldiers. What will you do then?" Chapter 643. Mo Xiuyao smiled lazily and said, "I am deep in Xiling, and Enchanting is also deep into Chu State. How can it be so easy to send reinforcements back? Even if the soldiers of the Chu State are all idiots, there are still millions of idiots, right? Furthermore, I only plan to bring 400,000 men to battle, leaving only 400,000 men in the Northwest. There are still 400,000 men, waiting for Enchanting at the border. When he breaks through the blockade, if I still can't pull down the Emperor of Xiling City, I'll let him kick my head around like a ball." Hearing this, even Su Qingchen couldn't help but suck in a breath. Even though Su Qingchen didn't know much about war, he still felt that a mere 400,000 men wanted to fight their way from the border to the Emperor of Xiling City. Mo Xiuyao pretended not to see Su Qingchen, and Su Hongyu's worries. He smiled and said, "This time, I'm afraid it will take a long time. I'll have to trouble Big Brother and Uncle to guard the Northwest." Su Qingchen's mind flashed. He said in a low voice, "You're saying that someone might take the opportunity to attack the Northwest?" It's very possible." Mo Xiuyao smiled and said, "If Enchanting can't break through the blockade in a short period of time, it's very likely that he'll turn to the Northwest. And it's very likely that I won't be able to come back in time to help. So." Su Qingchen's expression suddenly became exceptionally gloomy. "This one thinks that the prince knows that this one is powerless." Mo Xiuyao waved his hand and smiled cheerfully. "Scholars are better when they're ruthless. I have confidence in young Master Qingchen. Young Master Qingchen definitely has the ability to plan behind curtains and determine victory from 1,000 miles away. This prince has entrusted the entire family to Big Brother. Does Big Brother want to see your sister and brother-in-law suffer a crushing defeat and wander the world without a home to return to?" Mo Xiuyao. Young Master Qingchen's usual elegant smile disappeared once again. He stared calmly at Mo Xiuyao, but under that calmness, one could faintly see a shocking raging storm. Mo Xiuyao also knew that he couldn't really provoke the other party, so he said seriously, "Big Brother, it's not that I want to take a risk, it's just that the current situation is such that we have no choice. Big Brother, please forgive me." Su Qingchen snorted unhappily and said to Yi Li, "Li Er, are you really not going to change your Mr. Right?" Yi Li smiled, not helping either side. Mo Xiuyao pulled Yi Li into his arms and glanced at Su Qingchen unhappily. "Young Master Qingchen, it's better to tear down 10 temples than to tear down a marriage. I and Miss Li are deeply in love. Your words are not befitting of a gentleman." In an instant, Mo Xiuyao threw his guilt to the back of his mind. He glared at young Master Qingchen with hatred in his heart. "You want to steal eyes, Miss Li? Die of exhaustion. Idiot, this young master won't bicker with you." Young Master Qingchen resisted the urge to roll his eyes. "Princess Consort, the two Madame Su and young Madame Su request an audience." In the study, the four people were discussing the preparations for the deployment of troops when Qin Feng reported from outside the door. Yi Li was startled. Eldest aunt and second aunt? The two Madame Su knew that Yi Li was different from them, who only guarded a small space in the back courtyard. Usually, she was busy with important matters, so it was very easy for them to come to Yi Li. Even if they came to the Prince Ding mansion to visit the Empress and Hua Tianxiang, or occasionally to look for Su Qingchen who refused to go home, the guards would directly invite them in. Today, they came to request an audience so solemnly, it must be something important. Yi Li blinked and looked at Su Qingchen and Su Hongyu who were sitting to the side. Su Hongyu smiled faintly and said, It's not a big matter, Lear can go see them. Yili raised her eyebrows and looked at Su Qingqian in confusion. Su Qingqian's expression was calm and at ease. When she met Yi Li's questioning gaze, she coughed softly and said in a low voice, "It's about your third brother." Third brother? Yi Li blinked her eyes and came to a realization. This time, Su Qingfeng was going to go to war with them. At this time, the two madams came to her for Su Qingfeng. It was self-evident what it was about. Not knowing whether to laugh or cry, Yi Li shook her head and asked, "Isn't third brother free these days? He didn't come home?" Su Qingqian smiled and said, "He went back the day before, but disappeared again after showing his face. I heard that he entered the Prince Ding mansion early this morning." Yi Li looked at Qin Feng who was at the door. Qin Feng lowered his head and coughed softly. He smiled and said, "This morning, third young master Su did come to the prince's mansion. He sparred with someone in the martial arts hall for a while, then went to the library and hasn't come out since." It was said that the young masters of the Su family were obsessed with hiding from the two young masters. Not to mention the third young master who was holed up in the military camp all day and didn't dare to come out, there was also the fourth and fifth young masters who went to the north and rarely came back. Even the most elegant and refined young master Qingqian would rather stay in the prince's mansion study for half a month than return to the mansion. Qin Feng, a bachelor who dreamed of having a wife and children, couldn't understand. Second young master Su got married early, and didn't they live a happy life? Did they have to be chased all over the sky? They really didn't know how to appreciate their good fortune. How could the old bachelors in the Mahist army who couldn't find a wife endure this? Helplessly shaking her head, Yi Li stood up and said, "I'm going to see my two aunts. Qin Feng, invite third young master Su along." This subordinate obeys. Qin Feng said in a clear voice. His half-closed eyes flashed with the light of watching a good show. It was said that third young master Su had become more and more difficult to catch in the past 2 years. At least, the Su family couldn't catch him. However, this wasn't difficult for Qin Feng at all. After all, third young master Su was taught by him. In a pavilion near the water, a dark green lake brought some coolness and comfort to the midsummer June. Second Madame Su sat by the bed with an ugly expression. Beside her, eldest Madame Su and Qin Zheng were comforting her in soft voices. However, second Madame Su, who was infuriated by her son, wasn't so easy to appease. Although she couldn't get angry in front of her sister-in-law and daughter-in-law, her face was still gloomy. "Second aunt, what's the matter? Who made you angry?" Yi Li walked in slowly and said softly with a smile, "Who else could it be? The only one who can make me angry now is that unfilial son." Second Madame Su said angrily as she tugged at her handkerchief. Yi Li walked to her side and said with a smile, "Second aunt, are you talking about third brother? Now that he's in my manor, I'll have someone capture him and give him a good beating to vent second aunt's anger." Second Madame Su sighed and pulled Yi Li to sit down. She said, "What's the use of teaching him a lesson? That brat, his father has taught him a lesson so many times. Doesn't he still make me angry every day? Lear, tell me. I just want him to find a girl to marry. Do you think the girl will eat him up?" Hearing second Madame Su's words, Yi Li couldn't help but think of what eldest Madame Su said last year. It was true that the 5 young masters of the Su family were all outstanding. However, other than second brother, none of them were easy to deal with. Eldest Madame Su smiled and patted the back of her sister-in-law's hand. She said with a smile, "In any case, Zaire is obedient and Ruer is smart and cute. If they catch up to the 3 of us, won't you be worried to death?" Hearing eldest Madame Su's words, second Madame Su looked at the quiet and gentle Qin Zhang and felt comforted. In any case, she still had an obedient son, a virtuous and dignified daughter-in-law, and a smart and clever grandson. Thinking of her 3 sisters-in-law, she was worried. Chapter 644. Sister-in-law, aren't you worried? Madame Su smiled bitterly. "It's useless even if I'm worried until my hair turns white. Forget about Qingqian, I don't want to care about him anymore. Fourth brother and fifth brother are always away and don't want to come back. How can I ask them to get married and have children? I'll be satisfied as long as they come back to see me often. Eldest aunt, fourth brother and fifth brother are still young. They'll be fine after 2 years. How about this, if fourth brother and fifth brother still want to learn from eldest brother, Lear will help you hold 100 flowers banquet. We'll personally pick a wife for them that you like." Yi Li smiled faintly. Madame Su smiled, "Forget it. I can only comfort myself that they're still young." Madame Su was also very angry with her eldest son. Unfortunately, even her husband and grandfather couldn't say anything, so she gave up on the idea of Su Qingqian's marriage. However, she had to keep a close eye on her 2 younger sons. If they still didn't have a wife by the time they were 24 or 25 years old, she would tie them up and force them to get married. Otherwise, she wouldn't be able to face the ancestors of the Su family. Originally, second Madame Su's anger had gradually subsided after the three of them talked back and forth. However, when she raised her head, she saw Qin Feng leading Su Qingfeng over from outside the pavilion. Su Qingfeng's expression changed when he saw the people sitting in the pavilion. He shouted, "Qin Feng, you betrayed your friend." He turned around and ran outside. Madame Su's anger rose again. "Unfilial son. Stop right there. Am I your mother or your enemy from your previous life?" Madame Su's anger flared when she saw her son running away from her. Outside the door, Qin Feng looked leisurely as Su Qingfeng ran past him. He raised his hand and a long whip shot out from his sleeve. It wrapped around one of Su Qingfeng's legs and pulled him back. Su Qingfeng quickly flipped in the air and landed steadily. As soon as he stood still, he swept his leg toward Qin Feng. Qin Feng raised his eyebrows and began to fight with him with great interest. The two of them were fighting happily outside, but Madame Su's eyes were red with anger inside. She stood up and walked out of the pavilion. She shouted at Su Qingfeng, who was still fighting, "Su Qingfeng. Stop right there." Su Qingfeng was slightly stunned. In the blink of an eye, Qin Feng had already grabbed his right arm behind his back and locked his left shoulder with his other hand. He said with a smile, "Third young master, you've been fooling around too much these 2 years. Despicable." Su Qingfeng said unwillingly. "This is called grasping the opportunity. Don't you understand after staying in Qilin for so many years? Qilins are unscrupulous." Qin Feng replied with a calm smile. Su Qingfeng was speechless. "I just didn't expect you to be so ruthless to your own people." Ye Erli, who had followed them out, looked at the two of them and shook his head slightly. Third brother's personality was really not suitable for Qilin. Even though he had been working hard these past few years and was not worse than anyone in Qilin in all aspects. However, Yili still felt that he would be able to display his talents on a real battlefield. But, who hasn't been young before? Just like how every soldier in her previous life dreamed of becoming a special forces soldier, every soldier in the Mahist army also dreamed of being able to enter Qilin. It was not because Qilin's position and salary were high, but because Qilin represented the most elite force in the Mahist army. "Mother." Su Qingfeng looked at his mother's angry face and immediately became listless. He lifted his leg and kicked Qin Feng, muttering in a low voice, let go, let go. I won't run." Qin Feng glanced at him with a faint smile and let go of his hand that was restraining him. "You think you can run?" Mrs. Su sneered and said, "You still know that I'm your mother?" "Mother." Su Qingfeng knew that he was in the wrong and lowered his head. He did not have his eldest brother's ability to speak eloquently regardless of whether he was in the right or wrong. He also did not have his second brother's wooden face, which was always expressionless. Looking at her son's listless appearance, second Madame Su finally abandoned her decades of upbringing as a noble lady. She stepped forward and grabbed his ear and shouted, "Do you think your mother will harm you? Would you die if I let you get married? Our family is open-minded. I even gave you a chance to choose. Look at other families. How many of them have met before they got married? You don't know how lucky you are." "Mother, mother." His mother grabbed his ear in front of so many people. Although it did not hurt, it was very embarrassing. "Mother, your son knows that he was wrong. You know that you were wrong?" Mrs. Su raised her eyebrows. "Come with me to see Miss Yang." "Miss Yang? Which Miss Yang?" Su Qingfeng was confused. Mrs. Su's eyes twitched. "What did you say? Did her nagging last night go to waste?" "I don't want to see her. I've never heard of her. Who knows where she came from? Why did you give her to me? Even if she's not as good as cousin, she should be at least as good as second sister-in-law, right? Miss Yang? Is there such a letter in Li City? Mother, don't tell me you're so desperate that you gave me the daughter of a nouveau riche? Hungry and indiscriminate? That's what you get for being so desperate." Mrs. Su hit Su Qingfeng's head hard. "I told you to study since you were young but you didn't. Now you're desperate." "Mother? I was wrong." Su Qingfeng covered his head and scurried away. "That's not what I meant. In short, I don't want any Miss Yang or Miss Li. What I meant was that the girl I want to marry must be ancient and heavenly, ordinary." Bang! Before he could finish his sentence, something hit him hard on the head. Su Qingfeng stared blankly at the book that had flown over and slapped him on the forehead. He turned around and saw Hua Tianxiang standing not far away, calmly looking at him. He suddenly felt a little embarrassed. "Miss Hua, why are you?" Hua Tianxiang said lightly. "I was passing by and heard that Zheng Er was here so I came to see. I'll take my leave first." Looking at Hua Tianxiang's departing figure, Su Qingfeng turned around and asked blankly, "That? Why did Miss Hua hit me with that book?" A glimmer of light flashed in Yi Li's eyes. She smiled and said, "Because she is the daughter of the nouveau riche that you mentioned? Miss Yang." Su Qingfeng's face turned pale in an instant. Chapter 645. How could that be? Su Qingfeng stuttered. That was clearly his cousin, his second sister-in-law's good friend, Miss Hua of Duke Hua's household. Why did she become Miss Yang? Most importantly, why did she happen to appear there and hear what he said? Looking at Su Qingfeng's vexed expression, Yi Li and Qin Zheng quietly exchanged glances. Qin Zheng smiled and said, "Third brother, do you know her?" This. Su Qingfeng was somewhat embarrassed. In the past, in the capital, how many times did I meet her? Yi Li smiled and said, "So that's how it is, this matter is not important. Tianxiang is not such a narrow-minded person. Later, I will go and apologize on behalf of third brother. But, second aunt, since third brother does not have this intention, let's forget about this matter. Although Miss Yang is now living in the Prince Ding mansion, her family and Xiaoyao are family friends. We can't wrong her. After all, she was the one who gave birth to Su Qingfeng. How could second Madame Su not notice Su Qingfeng's strange behavior? She rolled her eyes and said to Yi Li with a smile, "Li this matter was reckless. I also saw that your third brother was going to go on a long trip and was momentarily anxious, so I lost my sense of propriety. You should properly talk to Miss Yang. Tomorrow, I will personally come and apologize. This unfilial son of mine, forget it, I am too lazy to care about him." Mother. Su Qingfeng somewhat anxiously looked at the door that had already disappeared. Then, he looked at his mother's leisurely face and could not help but blush. Second Madame Su calmly wiped the sweat on her forehead with a handkerchief and said to eldest Madame Su, "Eldest sister-in-law, seeing this unfilial son makes me angry. Let's go back." Eldest Madame Su looked at Su Qingfeng, covered her mouth and smiled, nodding, "That's good. In a while, let's go out of the city to see Old Master and Yuchen Rue. The coolness outside the city is much better than suffocating at home." Second Madame Su smiled and agreed, "Eldest sister-in-law is right. Let's go back first. Zheng it's fine if you go back later. While you are at it, apologize to Miss Yang on behalf of mother." Qin Zheng smiled faintly and bowed slightly. "Zheng understands. Aunt is satisfied. Mother, take care." After watching the two ladies leave, Qin Zheng and Yi Li looked at each other and smiled. They then looked at Su Qingfeng, who was standing at the side dejectedly. Yi Li blinked and walked over to Su Qingfeng with a smile. "Third brother, tell me, how did you get to know Ruohua?" Ruohua. Su Qingfeng was at a loss. Yi Li raised her eyebrows. Only then did Su Qingfeng come back to his senses. His usually straightforward face revealed a rare hint of embarrassment and shyness, making Yi Li and Qin Zheng laugh in their hearts. I've really seen him twice in the capital. Also, didn't I just come back to the Prince Ding mansion 2 days ago? Feng San asked me to send something to Mr. Shen. Then I saw her, with Wu Yo at Mr. Shen's place?" Su Qingfeng looked at Yi Li in distress. "Li I really didn't do it on purpose. I didn't know that she was Miss Yang. If I had known..." Yi Li looked at him with a smile and asked, "So what if third brother knew?" Su Qingfeng lowered his head and pondered for a moment. Then he shook his head dejectedly. "Forget it, it's nothing. Then, go and apologize to Miss Hua. Miss Yang for me. I really didn't do it on purpose." Qin Zheng looked at Yi Li in confusion. She didn't understand Su Qingfeng's sudden change. Yi Li said with a smile, "Don't you have to apologize in person to show sincerity?" Su Qingfeng shook his head. "Forget it. Miss Yang is a lady in the boudoir. It's not good for her reputation if I suddenly go. I'll leave first, second sister-in-law." Seeing Su Qingfeng turn and leave, Yi Li narrowed her eyes and raised her hand to grab Su Qingfeng. She said in a low voice, "Third brother, are you afraid that something will happen to you when you go to war and delay the lady? Are you afraid that when you come back alive, the lady will already have a husband?" Su Qingfeng looked at Yi Li in surprise. Yi Li said with a smile, "There's always a way to solve things. Go and explain it to Tianxiang. Our Prince Ding mansion's people don't like to gossip. Be good." Su Qingfeng's handsome face suddenly turned red. He took a few steps back and glared at Yi Li. Yi Li pulled Qin Zheng and waved at him. "Go quickly. Zheng and I still have things to talk about. We don't have time to deal with the aftermath for you. If no one apologizes to her today, the lady might be sad and..." Su Qingfeng's face turned white and he hurriedly left. Behind him, the two women looked at each other and then burst into laughter. "You tease third brother like this. Qinzheng shook her head and said after laughing enough. Yili helplessly shrugged. How am I teasing him? Third brother is a straightforward person. I'm afraid his temper is more honest than second brother's. If I didn't say this, he might have gone out with such thoughts. When he comes back, if Tianxiang has a wife, won't he cry to death? Third brother is in a mess because he's in the situation. When he comes back to his senses? What would he dare to do to me? Yili raised her head and laughed. Third brother can't beat me. And if it really happened, would she be afraid that third brother wouldn't thank her? In the guest courtyard of the Prince Ding mansion, in the spacious and quiet courtyard, China Tianxiang was sitting alone by the flower bed and sulking. She didn't think too much because of Su Qingfeng's words. After all, she knew a little about the character of the young masters of the Su family. Otherwise, she wouldn't have agreed to it when her aunt told her about second Madame Su's intentions. Looking at the situation at the time, she knew that Su Qingfeng was forced by second Madame Su to speak without thinking. Although she knew that Su Qingfeng didn't have any opinions about her, it was impossible for her not to be angry when a lady was disliked like this. At the time, she didn't hesitate to slap the thick book in her hand. Unfortunately, it didn't hit Su Qingfeng's face. Surnamed Su. Don't fall into this lady's hands. Su Qingfeng quietly landed in the garden from the top of the wall, just in time to see the beautiful and graceful woman pinching a flower with all her might. He couldn't help but shrink his neck. He wasn't really stupid. He didn't doubt that the lady was thinking of strangling his neck at this time. Ahem. Su Qingfeng coughed and looked awkwardly at Hua Tianxiang. When she turned her head and saw him, she was stunned at first, then her pretty face sank and she turned around to leave. That? Hua. Miss Yang. Su Qingfeng hurriedly called out. Hua Tianxiang turned her head and looked at him indifferently. Third young master Su, what advice do you have? Su Qingfeng awkwardly stepped forward and said, I didn't mean what I said just now. Please forgive me, Mississippi. Hua Tianxiang's beautiful face bloomed with a cold smile. You're too serious, young master Su. I'm just an upstart who doesn't know where I came from. How could I dare to blame third young master Su? Miss Yang. Looking at the cold face of the girl in front of him, Su Qingfeng only felt at a loss. Compared to going to the battlefield, fighting a war made him feel more nervous. In his heart, he was extremely regretful that he was not as eloquent as his eldest brother, fourth brother, and fifth brother. At the very least, he should have a wooden face like his second brother, which would not change even if Mount Tai collapsed in front of him. He did not even know if he was blushing at this moment. Chapter 646. Hua Tianxiang coldly looked at the embarrassed man in front of her. She could not help but twitch her lips and roll her eyes at the sky. Why does it look like I'm the one who's bullying him? If young Master Su has nothing else to say, please return. After waiting for a while, Su Qingfeng did not take the initiative to say anything. Hua Tianxiang did not feel like wasting time with him. Perhaps he could spend the entire afternoon here and the other party might not even be able to say a single word. Seeing Hua Tianxiang turn to leave, Su Qingfeng anxiously reached out to grab her. You, ah? Coming to his senses, Su Qingfeng realized that he had been rude to this young lady. He became even more flustered, almost unable to restrain himself from fleeing. However, he could not help but recall his cousin's whispered warning. Luofu has a husband? Luofu has a husband? Immediately, the scene of the woman before him being led by a man whose face could not be seen clearly appeared in his mind. Su Qingfeng hurriedly shook his head, shaking off the image in his mind. He and Hua Tianxiang had indeed met twice in the Chujing capital. However, Su Qingfeng did not pay much attention to it. It was only when he returned to the capital 2 days ago that, in order to avoid his mother, he used the excuse of helping Feng Jiao deliver something to the Prince Ding mansion. Coincidentally, he ran into Hua Tianxiang, who was chatting with Princess Chang'e at Shenyang's residence. At first glance, he was shocked by her beauty. At the time, Su Qingfeng did not pay much attention to her. It was only when he returned home that his mother pulled him aside and told him a bunch of things about his marriage. Originally, he only felt a headache when he heard these words. However, in his mind, that beautiful face constantly flashed. Su Qingfeng was not a fool. He naturally understood that he had a favorable impression of this young lady. However, because he was about to go to war, he did not dare to think too much about it. He did not expect that before he had even begun, he would have already offended her. Hua Tianxiang looked at the man before her with a strange expression, speechless. Miss Yang. I really did not do it on purpose. I didn't know it was you. My mother always mentioned it to me, and I was forced to say those words. Actually, I wanted to tell my mother that I already have someone I like. At this point, Su Qingfeng's ears turned red and he lowered his head. Hua Tianxiang couldn't help but frown. Since it's just a misunderstanding, let's just resolve it. I don't blame young Master Su. Young Master, please go back. Goodbye. Seeing Hua Tianxiang turn around and leave, Su Qingfeng couldn't help but be stunned. Did he say something wrong? Outside the moon-shaped door not far behind him, Yi Li and Qin Zheng could not help but roll their eyes. Third brother wasn't usually so silly. Yi Li clenched her teeth and took off a hair clip from her hair and threw it at Su Qingfeng. With a loud bang, it hit Su Qingfeng's head. Su Qingfeng rubbed his head and looked back. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Li second sister-in-law, what are you doing here? Idiot, confess. Yi Li reminded him in a low voice. Eh? Third young Master Su's face turned red. He turned around and stole a glance at Hua Tianxiang, who had just turned into a flower bush and left. Yi Li said resentfully, if you don't say it clearly, how will she know what you mean? Qin Zheng covered her mouth and laughed. Third brother, I'm afraid Tianxiang will think you like another girl. I didn't, if you didn't, then hurry up. Finally realizing what was wrong, Su Qingfeng quickly turned around and chased after them. Yi Li and Qin Zheng looked at each other and quietly followed. They had only taken 2 steps when they heard Su Qingfeng's voice not far away. Miss Yang, what I mean is that the person I like is you. Su Qingfeng's voice was not loud, but it was definitely not soft. At least, Yi Li and Qin Zheng, who were still standing at the gate, heard it clearly. They could not bear to watch and covered their faces with a long sigh. Behind the flower bush, Hua Tianxiang was shocked by his sudden confession. Before he could say anything, a figure fell from the treetops on the fence with a thud. Su Qingfeng quickly shielded Hua Tianxiang behind him. He glared at the unknown shadow guard in front of him with dissatisfaction. What are you doing here? I'm standing guard. Sorry to disturb you, please continue. The secret guard said expressionlessly and calmly. He leaped back onto the treetop and thought for a moment before adding, congratulations? Thank you very much. Su Qingfeng smiled foolishly. The shadow guard, who had just climbed up the tree, fell again, but this time, he was outside the wall. The third son of the Su family could not be so stupid. He must be standing guard in the wrong position. When third young Master Su came back to his senses and turned around, he saw Hua Tianxiang glaring at him before running away. Third young Master Su was at a loss. Did I say something wrong again? You didn't say anything wrong, but you chose the wrong place. Yi Li and Qin Zheng walked out from behind the flower bush and glared at him angrily. What do you mean? Yi Li smiled and said, it wasn't just us. There were at least 10 people in and out of the courtyard who heard your confession. So what? Of course, he knew that there were many shadow guards in the Prince Ding mansion. It was just that their mental fortitude was too weak. The one just now had fallen twice in a short time. Qin Zheng angrily glared at him. Third brother, Ruohua is an unmarried girl. You want her to? Su Qingfeng suddenly understood. Li second sister-in-law, thank you for your advice. I'll be leaving first. After saying this, third young Master Su turned and ran out of the courtyard. Where are you going? To invite my mother to propose marriage? Third young Master Su's voice came from afar. Yi Li and Qin Zheng, who were left behind, could only look at each other. Princess consort, young Madam Su. The Empress walked out from behind the fake mountain with Hua Tianxiang. When she saw Yi Li and Qin Zheng, Hua Tianxiang shyly lowered her head. Yi Li went forward and said apologetically, Madam, third brother is straightforward and doesn't care about trifles. Please forgive him if he has neglected you and Ruohua. However, the Su family definitely did not have any intention of bullying you. Please believe me on this. The Empress smiled and said, I naturally believe Princess Consort's words. Third young Master Su, is also a person of temperament. Seeing that Yi Li and the Empress had something to say, Qin Zheng also wanted to probe her good friend's thoughts. She pulled Hua Tianxiang and laughed in a low voice. Let's talk. The Empress smiled at her niece and said, Go, Princess Consort, and I also want to talk. Qin Zheng then pulled Hua Tianxiang away. The Empress turned to look at Yi Li and said, I believe in Princess Consort and the Su family's sincerity. I'm afraid that today's matter was a misunderstanding. However, although third young Master Su has already expressed his feelings to Ruohua, but Yi Li smiled and said, we naturally can't force a marriage. Even if Ruohua and third brother are not fated to be together, I guarantee that today's matter will not affect her reputation. The shadow guard of the Prince Ding mansion won't casually spread gossip. I've made Princess Consort worry, the Empress said apologetically. What are you saying, madam? One of them is my cousin, and the other is a close friend. How can I worry about them? Yili said with a faint smile. Chapter 647. By the time Yili finished speaking with the Empress, Qin Zhang and Hua Tianxiang had returned hand in hand. Seeing the smile on Qin Zhang's face and Hua Tianxiang's blushing face, Yili knew the answer. She didn't say anything to make Hua Tianxiang uncomfortable and just smiled at her. Hua Tianxiang blushed and whispered, Thank you. Silly words. The Su family acted quickly. The next morning, second Madame Su came to propose marriage. Since both the man and woman were interested, the Empress naturally wouldn't make things difficult and agreed. In the end, because the battle was imminent, the two families agreed to marry next year. Although she regretted that she couldn't marry her daughter-in-law immediately, second Madame Su breathed a sigh of relief and her face was full of joy. Seeing this, eldest Madame Su was both envious and helpless. Unfortunately, her sons were each more difficult to deal with than the last. She was afraid that she wouldn't be able to make them submit. After Su Qingfeng's marriage was settled, the day of the battle arrived in the blink of an eye. It was the 26th of June. Early in the morning, the sky was clear and the clouds were light. Glass City, which was usually bustling with noise and excitement, was unusually quiet. However, outside Glass City, there was a sea of people. The sound of drums shook the sky. The Mahist army dressed in black held shiny weapons in their hands and stood in an orderly manner at the city gate, waiting for orders. The people who came to see them off looked around and only saw a black wave that seemed to have no end. Among the black waves, there were countless silver lights that flickered under the sun, adding a bit of coldness and sharpness to the hot summer day. Behind these soldiers, strong and powerful horses stood quietly. Even the earth-shattering sound of the war drums could not alarm them at all. Beside each warhorse stood a tall and straight figure wrapped in a black robe. This combination of one man and one horse made people feel as if they could see their heroic bearing on the battlefield. This is the Black Cloud Cavalry. Among the people who came to see them off, someone curiously whispered. People always instinctively admired heroes. All the men looked at them with a bit more reverence, and all the girls had a bit more admiration in their eyes. As expected of the Black Cloud Cavalry. Under the heavens, only the Prince Ding mansion has such elite troops. Everyone was discussing and looking at the city gate in front of them with even more respect. At the city gate, all the civil and military officials of Glass City came to send the army off. Even Mr. Qingyun and Su Jie, who usually did not care about worldly affairs, came with the students of Lishan Academy. Perhaps because of the military service system in the Northwest, the scholars in the Northwest had to go through at least a year of military service after reaching a certain age before they could take the exam to become an official. Therefore, in the Northwest, scholars looked down on military generals. The concept of civil and military officials belittling each other was much weaker than in other places. There were even some students who threw away their pen and joined the army after serving in the military. In the future, Glass City will have to rely on Mr. Qingyun. Mo Xiuyao respectfully bowed to Mr. Qingyun. Mr. Qingyun quickly reached out to support him and nodded with a smile, "Prince, don't worry. On this trip, this old man will congratulate Prince in advance for his victory." Mo Xiuyao smiled and said, "Many thanks for grandfather's auspicious words. Mother doesn't want Xiao Bao anymore?" Xiao Bao pitifully pulled on Yi Li's clothes and looked up at her with his big watery eyes. Yi Li sighed softly and leaned over to stroke his little head. "Mother is going to go on a long journey with your father. Xiao Bao must be obedient at home and listen to your grandfather and granduncle's words, understand? Mother is lying to me. Mother is clearly going to war with father, not going on a long trip." Xiao Bao angrily said. Yi Li helplessly said, "All right, mother is going to war. Xiao Bao will be obedient at home." Xiao Bao also wants to help mother in the war. Xiao Bao excitedly said. Yi Li's face was filled with black lines. Sure enough, she knew it. "No, you're too young. You can only go when you grow up." Yi Li shook her head and said. Xiao Bao regretfully looked at the soldiers standing in the distance, his big eyes shining. "Really? When Xiao Bao grows up, I can lead so many soldiers to war." Yi Li speechlessly nodded. Although she wasn't a pure and kind person, she could still be considered a lover of peace. Why would the son she gave birth to be so excited when it came to war? Mo Xiuyao, who had finished talking with Mr. Qingyun, turned around and lifted Xiao Bao to look at him. Xiao Bao's little face was stiff as he looked at his father. He was still angry that his father didn't let him sleep with his mother last night. "Be obedient at home?" Mo Xiuyao raised his eyebrows and said lightly. Xiao Bao frowned coldly and said in an even more indifferent tone, "Protect mother well, and win the war." Mo Xiuyao reached out to rub his son's little head and asked, "Is there nothing else you want to say?" Xiaobao hesitated and then said with some hesitation, "Be careful." Clearly, Xiaobao was not used to showing concern to his father who had always been his enemy. When the others saw Xiaobao's hesitation and calmness, they couldn't help but laugh in their hearts. But no one dared to embarrass little heir Xiaobao. Su Qingqian lightly coughed and said to the two, "Be careful. Glass City has me, you don't have to worry." Mo Xiuyao nodded and said, "Of course I trust Qingqian Gongzi. I'll leave everything to you." Yili softly said, "Big brother, take care. Be careful." Su Qingqian softly exhorted as he looked at the woman in white who didn't wear any makeup and didn't wear any hairpins. The women of the Su family also came forward to say goodbye to Yi Li. Eldest Madam Su looked at Yi Li and said seriously, "Yu Chen and Junhan, you don't have to worry. Eldest aunt and second aunt will take good care of them. You must be careful outside. Yi Li, take care." Qin Zhang and Hua Tianxiang held on to Yi Li and said softly. Although they already knew that Li Er was different from them, but now that they saw her standing beside Prince Ding with a calm expression, they truly realized that their good friend was really different from them. Since ancient times, the stories of women going to the battlefield were legends to them. But now, not only did they admire her ability and courage, but they were also envious of her courage to stand side by side with her husband. "I know. You all take care too," Yi Li said with a smile. "Prince, Princess, it's almost time." Zhuo Jing, dressed in martial attire, came forward and reported in a low voice. Mo Xiuyao nodded and said to Yi Li, "Li, we should set off." "Okay." Yi Li nodded and replied with a smile. Chapter 648. Outside Glass City, amidst the deafening war drums, two white figures walked side by side and stood proudly in front of the hundreds of thousands of soldiers. The Mo family army, which seemed to have no end in sight, was completely silent as the black banners fluttered in the wind. Everyone looked at the man and woman in white in front of them with trust and respect. Behind Yi Li were the generals who were going to go with her. Zhang Qilan, Lu Jingxian, Feng Jiao, Mo Hua, Zhuo Jing. With wine as a sacrifice to the heavens, the air outside the city was filled with the faint fragrance of wine. After drinking a cup of wine with the people who came to send them off, as well as the Mo family soldiers, Mo Xiuyao announced in a clear voice, "Set off." His clear and melodious voice, mixed with his inner strength, spread throughout the entire area. "Yes, sir." Hundreds of thousands of people shouted in unison. Mo Xiuyao and Yi Li looked at each other and smiled. They walked to their horses at the front and mounted them. Taking the lead, the horses and carriages headed towards the official road in the distance. Following behind them were the various generals of the Mo family army. The Mo family army soldiers behind them also slowly began to move, gradually forming a long black dragon that gradually went further and further away. Until the last group of Mahist army soldiers left the city gate, the people who were waiting outside the city to send them off gradually dispersed. Su Hongyu and Su Qingqian supported Master Qingyun on both sides and said, "Father, let's go back too." Master Qingyun nodded and sighed to his two sons and grandson, Azure Dragon soaring. Glass City will have a lot of things to do in the future. Prince Ding actually entrusted the Northwest to you guys. You guys have to take care of it. Su Hongyu said respectfully, "Father, don't worry. The Northwest is the lifeline of the Prince Ding mansion and the Mahist army. I don't dare to neglect it." Master Qingyun looked at his son and grandson in front of him and nodded with gratification. He smiled. "In the future, not only the world, but also the Northwest. You guys have to be careful." "Father, thank you for your reminder. I understand." Mo Xiaobao held Ling Junhan and Su Jirui's hands and looked at the adults in front of him. Although he was smart enough, there were still some words that he couldn't understand. But he knew that Taigong was telling his granduncle and uncle something. "Taigong, Yuchen also needs to help." Mr. Qingyun smiled and rubbed Xiaobao's head. "You, being obedient means you've helped." Xiaobao wrinkled his nose in grievance. He was no longer a child. Su Qingqian bent over and picked up Mo Xiaobao. He smiled and said, "Take good care of Jirui and Junhan. This will be a great help to uncle." Satisfied, Xiaobao snuggled into his uncle's arms. He must agree to immortal uncle's request. Looking at the two little buns beside him, Mo Xiaobao's sense of responsibility immediately swelled. These two little kids didn't know anything and obviously needed someone to take care of them. All right, this prince will reluctantly take good care of them. Raising his head to look at the black dragon walking further and further away, Mo Xiaobao rubbed his nose against Su Qingqian's chest, feeling a little sour. Xiaobao really misses his mother. The northwest area wasn't large. With the Mahist army's marching speed, it only took a few days to reach the border between the northwest and Xiling. The Mahist army didn't stop at all and didn't give the Xiling border guards time to react. In just 2 days, they broke through the border city of Xiling. This was also the first time someone had broken through the border city of Xiling since the establishment of Xiling. At this time, Xiling's god of war Enchanting was still in Dechu state, casting his ambitious gaze towards the rich south of Dechu state. Receiving the battle report, Enchanting shattered the Celadon teacup in shock. He suddenly stood up and roared, "Emo Xiaoyao." The generals below who had been full of confidence looked at each other, not understanding what had happened. One of them gathered his courage and asked, "Prince? The Mahist army sent troops to help Dechu state? Even so, we don't have to be afraid of him." Although the Mahist army's bravery was well known, they weren't just facing Xiling this time. They were facing the northern region and the northern tribes at the same time. Although they didn't know what the northern region was like, they weren't simple to be able to get a few hundred miles away from the Chu capital in just a few months. As for the northern tribes, everyone knew that the barbarians beyond the Great Wall were valiant and good at fighting. The Prince Ding Mansion wanted to fight 1 against 3, and the outcome was still unknown. "Yes, Prince, calm down. We don't have to be afraid of Emo Xiaoyao." Many people thought so, and the generals all rubbed their palms together. It was as if they had completely forgotten the scene of being beaten to a pulp by the Mahist army a few years ago. Enchanting sneered, "Send troops to help Dechu state?" "Humph. Emo Xiaoyao did send troops, but not to help Dechu state, but to attack Xiling." "What?" Everyone was shocked. After his initial anger subsided, Enchanting also calmed down. He said in a low voice, "Emo Xiaoyao and Yili personally led hundreds of thousands of troops to attack Xiling. They have already broken through, and the hundreds of thousands of troops guarding the border were caught off guard and fled. Trash. Hundreds of thousands of troops couldn't even last 2 days. It was impossible for Enchanting to not be on guard against Emo Xiaoyao. Even during normal times, he kept a close eye on the Mahist army, much less during wartime. So even when he led the entire country to attack Dechu state, he didn't forget to station hundreds of thousands of troops at the northwest border. But he didn't expect that hundreds of thousands of troops couldn't even last 2 days under Emo Xiaoyao's hands. Emo Xiaoyao clearly promised not to interfere. Now that he's publicly breaking the agreement, he's really despicable. Enchanting sneered, "Despicable? The so-called agreement is only valid if one is willing to abide by it. If one isn't willing to abide by it, then it's just a piece of paper." Moreover, Emo Xiaoyao promised not to interfere in the war between Eastern Chu and Xiling. He really hadn't interfered in the war between the two countries. He had directly sent troops to attack Xiling Prince. This subordinate is willing to lead troops to reinforce the border. Someone requested. Enchanting closed his eyes and said in a low voice, "Emo Xiaoyao only brought 400,000 troops into Xiling. There are also hundreds of thousands of troops guarding Xiling's border." Everyone was shocked. "Emo Xiaoyao wants to prevent us from returning to reinforce Xiling?" That's right. The general guarding Xiling's border is Zhang Qilan of the Mahist army. Although he isn't that old, he's a veteran of the Mahist army. If our entire army returns, he naturally can't stop us, but he can delay us for a while. Most importantly, once we retreat, it's hard to guarantee that the Eastern Chu soldiers won't take the opportunity to pursue. At that time, we'll be attacked from both sides, Enchanting said indifferently. His face seemed to have aged several years in an instant, becoming gloomy and dim. What he didn't say was that even if they successfully returned to stop the Mahist army, everything they had done in the past 2 months in Eastern Chu would have been for naught. Although the Eastern Chu soldiers weren't brave enough, they weren't immovable clay figurines. In the past 2 months, Xiling's soldiers had suffered many casualties. If they returned without accomplishing anything and even put Xiling in danger, then his position as Prince Regent would come to an end, no matter how powerful he was. Only now did Enchanting understand that he had been completely played by Emo Xiaoyao. He even suspected that Emo Xiaoyao had been biding his time these past few years in order to wait for him to attack the Dechu state. Because Emo Xiaoyao himself couldn't attack the Dechu state no matter what. Chapter 649. Emo Xiaoyao? What a good Emo Xiaoyao! Enchanting said through gritted teeth. "Prince, are we just going to?" The general below said with righteous indignation. "What about it? Were they going to ignore the Western Tomb and continue to attack the Dechu state? That was clearly impossible. But were they going to give up on the Dechu state's territory and return? How could they be willing to do that?" Someone said hesitantly, "The Crown Prince is guarding the imperial city. Perhaps he can stop the Mahist army's attack." We'll send a portion of our forces back to reinforce. As he said this, his voice trailed off. Although their military strength far exceeded the Mahist armies, if they were to send half of their forces back, they would first have to pass through the 400,000 Mahist army's blockade. Only then would they be able to face Mo Xiuyao's elites. Not to mention how many people would be left at this time. Just how much of an effect these people would have against Mo Xiuyao's army was already worrying. The room was silent for a long time before Lei Zhenting's voice sounded, "Deputy General, I will leave you 300,000 men. Continue to attack Eastern Chu. Do not advance prematurely." Sitting next to the army's deputy, who was also Lei Zhenting's trusted aide, stood up and said in a clear voice, "This subordinate obeys. Prince, please be at ease." Lei Zhenting nodded and said, "I will lead the remaining people back to the western tomb as quickly as possible. I hope we can still make it." Everyone wanted to comfort the prince that he didn't need to worry too much. Mo Xiuyao wouldn't be able to reach the emperor of Xiling City in a short 10 days. But seeing their prince's tired expression, they couldn't bring themselves to say any words of comfort. Lei Zhenting waved his hand and said, "You can all withdraw. This subordinate will withdraw." The generals retreated respectfully. In the empty room, Lei Zhenting sat alone under the dim light. After a long time, he waved his hand and swept all the files and teacups off the table onto the floor. Mo Xiuyao. It was just as Lei Zhenting had predicted. Or rather, the Mahist army had repeated the scene when the West Hill attacked the Dechu state a few years ago. In just half a month, the 400,000 Mahist army had already taken down 4 cities in West Hill and advanced to Bian City in the hinterland of West Hill. This city was second only to the Emperor Xiling City in Xiling. It was even more prosperous than An City, which was originally occupied by the Murong family. This was because this was the only way to get to Glass City and even the Central Plains. The liveliness and prosperity of this place went without saying. More importantly, although the West Hill was vast, most of the areas were not suitable for growing food. Of the few remaining places that could produce food, half of them were near Bian City. There was also the Longshan Academy, which was one of the 3 great academies in the world and was as famous as Lishan Academy. It was located on Longshan, east of Bian City. Such an important place naturally couldn't be compared to others. When the Mahist army arrived, Lei Tingfeng, who was originally in the imperial city, had also led 300,000 troops to Bian City. Thus, the two armies faced off for the first time in Bian City. The previous few battles could only be considered a one-sided suppression by the Mahist army. Lei Tingfeng had led his troops all the way to Bian City and was extremely tired. The Mahist army had continuously fought and marched for more than 20 days and were also exhausted. Thus, Mo Xiuyao gave the order to set up camp outside Bian City and rest for a while before beginning the siege. In the large tent of the Mahist army, all the generals were in high spirits. The consecutive victories made them excited but also a little unsatisfied. Thus, when Mo Xiuyao gave the order to stop the siege, many people couldn't hold back and came forward to ask for battle. Mo Xiuyao and Yili sat side by side on the main seat of the tent. They leaned against the armrest and looked with half a smile at the people who were arguing about who should attack first. Feng Jiao lazily sat on the chair and looked at them arguing with a smile. He picked his ear and looked at Mo Xiuyao. "Prince, you should say something. Otherwise, we'll really start fighting." Hearing this, the people arguing immediately stopped. Dozens of pairs of eyes looked at Mo Xiuyao. Mo Xiuyao said unhurriedly, "Didn't I say it already? Set up camp and rest. We'll attack again tomorrow." Yunting didn't understand. "But Prince, Lei Tingfeng's 300,000 reinforcements have already arrived. Shouldn't we take advantage of the fact that they're tired and unprepared?" Mo Xiuyao glanced at him and said lightly, "They're tired, but we're even more tired than they are. Do you all think that we've been fighting too smoothly, so the West Hill can't withstand a single blow? Don't forget, in the last decade or two, the West Hill has always had the upper hand in the battle between the West Hill and the Dechu state. Isn't that because the Mahist army didn't participate in the battle?" Some people muttered in their hearts. Mo Xiuyao said carelessly, "The reason why we've been winning so smoothly these days is because of 2 reasons. One is because Lei Zhenting sent most of his elites to attack the Dechu state. Another is because we caught them off guard and they couldn't react in time. Although the West Hill often invades other people's borders, they haven't fought in their own land for many years. Their weaknesses are very similar to the Mahist army. They're good at attacking and not good at defending. I can tell you all very seriously that our battle really began in Bian City." Lu Jingxian frowned. "Prince is overestimating Lei Tingfeng. Prince isn't overestimating Lei Tingfeng." Yi Li, who had been listening to them in silence, said, Bian City is the largest city in the West Hill besides the Imperial City. It can be said that there are hidden dragons and crouching tigers here. Hidden dragons and crouching tigers? Everyone looked at each other. They really hadn't heard of any important people in the West Hill. Yili smiled and shook his head. There were 3 famous generals in the West Hill before Genom of Gojosian. Has anyone here heard of them? Everyone present was a general. Naturally, most of them knew this like the back of their hand. Yunting said in a deep voice, reporting to Wang Fei, the 3 famous generals of Xiling are Xiling Fengtian Great General Long Yang, Xiling Jingtian Great General Zhu Yan, and Xiling Shuntian Great General Feng Ao. These 3 people are said to be the best friends of the former emperor of the West Hill, Emperor Xianwen. After Emperor Xianwen ascended the throne, he opened up the territory for him and fought everywhere. During Emperor Xuanwen's reign, the territory of the West Hill expanded to the west, nearly 1/3 of the original territory. But only Zhu Yan had fought with the Emperor Xianwen. One of them tied and the other lost. The other 2 have always been in the west and north. After the Emperor of Xiling ascended the throne, he was under the control of his younger brother, Genom of Gojosian. But these 3 generals were loyal to Emperor Xianwen and to the Emperor of Xiling chosen by Emperor Xianwen, so they didn't get along with Genom of Gojosian. They were stripped of their military power by Genom of Gojosian. This was 20 years ago. The others also nodded. What they knew was mostly the same as what Yunting said. The youngest of the 3 generals should be 70 years old now. No one knew if he was still alive. Even if he was, it was impossible for him to fight on the battlefield. Yili smiled faintly. Unfortunately, 2 of the 3 generals are now in Bian City. Fengtian General Long Yang and Jingtian General Zhu Yan. Everyone was silent. Chapter 650. Mo Xiuyao looked at the crowd with a smile. Everyone, do you still want to fight? After a moment of silence, someone finally said, of course. But, we can take a break before fighting. Finally, someone said. Bian City didn't only have the 300,000 people brought by Lei Tingfeng. The defenders around Bian City, plus the scattered soldiers from the front, added up to at least 200,000 people. Even if Long Yang and Zhu Yan didn't get along with Lei Tingfeng, they wouldn't just stand by and watch Bian City being besieged. They were probably already prepared and waiting for them. Bravely moving forward was a good thing, but recklessly moving forward without seeing the reality in front of them was stupid and impulsive. Mo Xiuyao nodded with satisfaction. Very good, now go and rest. Tomorrow, show I your siege plan. I'll leave. Everyone retreated. Feng Jiao, who walked at the back, hesitated for a moment, but still stayed. Mo Xiuyao glanced at him and said unhappily, what else do you want to say? Feng Jiao thought for a moment and sat down again. Prince? Long Yang and Zhu Yan are really in Bian City? Mo Xiuyao was amused. Is there any benefit for I to lie to you? Feng Jiao sighed. This luck is too bad. It's okay to meet one of these old monsters, but how can you meet 2 at the same time? I heard that in the past, even the regent had a hard time winning against Zhu Yan. Dechu State's former regent Mo Lufang was known as a peerless genius. He had never been defeated in his life, but he had reached a tie with Zhu Yan. This was enough to prove that this Jingtian general was not simple. What's more, although the other Fengtian general had never fought against the Mahist army, but in the western region, this General Long's name was more famous than the Emperor of Xiling. He swept through the small countries in the western region, and his killing name had reached the point where children would cry at night. Mo Xiuyao smiled. Indeed, our luck isn't too good. It may be a bit difficult for these old generals to charge and break through the enemy lines. But as a military advisor to guide Lei Tingfeng, it's enough for you to suffer. But our luck isn't too bad. There's a flat land in front of Bian City. Otherwise, we would be unlucky before we reach the city. Feng Jiao was puzzled. What do you mean? You don't plan to do it yourself? Mo Xiuyao smiled. If I do it, I won't be better. I don't like city battles. Feng Jiao could not help but roll his eyes. Do you still have the right to choose whether you like it or not during a battle? Even if I don't like it, it will not disappear. Mo Xiuyao said with some regret, speaking of which, this king really wants to meet these old generals. But it's a pity, they are old. Maybe it was because Mo Xiuyao was too outstanding, or maybe it was because the reputation of the Ding Palace was too strong. In Mo Xiuyao's generation, there was almost no one who could compete with him. Compared to his father, or even his elder brother, Mo Xiuyao was undoubtedly lonely at that time. When people mentioned Prince Ding, they always praised him for his strategizing and his ability to fight. But only he knew that it had been a long time since he was able to fight to his heart's content. How do you know they didn't train their descendants? Feng Jiao muttered in a low voice. Mo Xiuyao smiled. If that's the case, then it's even better. That way, it will be more interesting. In the end, Feng Jiao, who still couldn't find out what Mo Xiuyao meant, left angrily. In the tent, Yili leaned on Mo Xiuyao's chest and asked softly, "These two old generals are indeed not simple. We really have to be careful. Are we really not going to care about them when we attack the city tomorrow?" Mo Xiuyao smiled faintly. Killing their spirit is also good. This journey has been too smooth. It's not good. Yili nodded. She understood Mo Xiuyao's worries. In fact, this was also her worry. Although the sudden appearance of these two old generals in Bian City may break their original plan. However, it was much better than letting these soldiers face their future enemies with excessive pride or even walk on the path of destruction. In this world, it wasn't only the Mahist army that was elite, and it wasn't only Mo Xiuyao who knew how to fight. Do we have enough time? If we let Enchanting rush back. At that time, the ones being attacked from the front and back will be us. Holding her hand, Mo Xiuyao said, "Don't worry. No matter what, if Zhang Qilan can't even hold off the 400,000-strong army for a month or two, then his efforts over the years have been in vain. Besides, I have some other gifts for Enchanting." Yili thought, Murongshen? And Nanjiao? Other than Mo Jingli's army in the south, the only ones who could pose a threat to Enchanting in the south were Murongshen and Nanjiao, who guarded Shattered Snow Pass. Mo Jingli defended his territory to the death. Unless Enchanting defeated Yunlanjiang, his army in the south would not move. So only Murongshen and Nanjiao were left. What benefits did you promise Princess Anqi? Wars between nations were not as simple as friendship. Without tangible benefits, it would not work. Mo Xiuyao would not hide anything from Yili. He said with a smile, "I didn't talk to her. Look, I just received the letter today." Yili took the letter and read it. She said with a smile, "It's from Big Brother? Big Brother, negotiated with Princess Anqi?" She sighed slightly. Big Brother, he's the brains of the whole Northwest and the Prince Ding mansion, Mo Xiuyao said firmly, holding her hand. Su Qingqian was doing what he was supposed to do, even though it would gradually weaken his friendship with Princess Anqi. It was not that Princess Anqi would have any opinions, but when the two sides stood on their own interests, the original friendship would gradually fade and they would get used to their present and future relationship. But Mo Xiuyao did not intend to apologize to Su Qingqian for this. Yili shook her head and said, "Give them the 3 states near the border of Nanjiao?" Did Princess Anqi agree? This kind of condition was too illusory. Whether or not the Mo family army could win against the Xiling army was still uncertain. Mo Xiuyao said with a smile, "Nanjiao must choose between the Prince Ding mansion and Enchanting. Befriending the distant and attacking the nearby. Even if they become enemies with the Prince Ding mansion, Nanjiao will not gain any benefits. But if they cooperate with the Prince Ding mansion, it may be possible to swallow a few states in West Hill." "Do you really intend to give West Hill to Nanjiao?" Yili raised her eyebrows. "This is a matter for the future. I don't even have it now." So, it was still empty talk. Chapter 651. Outside an inconspicuous mansion in the west of Bian City, a strong man in military uniform knocked on the closed door. Not long after, someone came to answer the door. A young man who looked like a servant poked his head out and saw the person at the door. He was stunned and asked, "Excuse me, who are you looking for, General?" Leitingfeng cupped his hands and smiled, "I'm Leitingfeng. I'm here to pay my respects to General Jingtian. I hope you'll grant me an audience." Unexpectedly, the servant's face darkened and he said, "What General Jingtian? We don't have such a person in our family. General, you've come to the wrong place." After that, without waiting for Leitingfeng's reaction, he retracted his head and slammed the door. Looking at the door slamming in front of him, Leitingfeng helplessly touched his nose and smiled bitterly. His father had a deep grudge with the old generals. It was only because his father was a famous general himself that he didn't need the help of the 3 generals. In fact, the 3 generals even hindered his father's power in the court. This was why he offended them so much. Leitingfeng felt lucky that Zhu Yan just closed the door and did not directly let the dog out. Leitingfeng could accept such treatment, but the generals and attendants behind Leitingfeng could not. They were all people who were cultivated and promoted by Zenom of Gojoseon. They were more loyal to Jinan Palace than to the West Hill court. Of course, they had heard of the names of the 3 great generals, but these 3 were old men with one foot in the grave. What's more, even if they had outstanding achievements, weren't they defeated by their prince? What arrogance! Prince, I'll break the door down. The general behind Leitingfing said. Leitingfing waved his hand and said, leave, don't be rude. They waited outside the door for a while, but there was no more movement inside. Leitingfing thought for a moment, condensed his chi and internal energy, and said loudly, Junior Leitingfing from Jinan Palace requests an audience with old General Zhu. In the Zhu estate, two white-haired old men were sitting in the main hall, facing off against a chessboard. Leitingfing's voice, which was infused with his inner strength, naturally entered their ears without any hindrance. One of them was an old man wearing a dark blue robe embroidered with the word fortune. He smiled and stroked his beard. He didn't look like a general who had gone to war, but more like a benevolent old immortal. Enchanting has been arrogant all his life. This son? I'm afraid he's not as good. The other old man was indeed skinny, but his eyes were clear and bright. He was dressed in white clothes made of coarse cloth. If it weren't for his eyes, he would have looked more like an ordinary old man from the mountains. It said that like father, like son. But if the father is too powerful, it's hard for the son not to be overshadowed by the father. How many can there be like the one in the Prince Ding mansion? Moreover, if it weren't for the deaths of Mo Lufang and Mo Xiaowen in the Prince Ding mansion in just a few years, the Prince Ding mansion would have suffered a great blow. Mo Xiaoyao might not be as powerful as he is now. Maybe he's just a famous general. But now, Prince Ding's elegance and reputation had already surpassed his father and brother, and even all the ancestors under Mo Lan Yun. The old man in blue sighed, you're right. A sword's edge is sharpened by grinding, and the fragrance of plum blossoms comes from the bitter cold. Enchanting's son, in the end, still hasn't been sharpened enough. The old man in white smiled. This kid, compared to Enchanting, he's more tolerant. In the past few decades, the Dechu state and the Ding mansion weren't the only ones who had suffered various blows. When Emperor Xianwen passed away, Enchanting also wantonly eliminated dissidents after taking power. He killed or exiled a large number of famous officials and generals. If Emperor Xianwen could live for another 20 years, the current West Hill would definitely be in a completely different situation. It was a pity that Emperor Xianwen, who had a great reputation, chose a cowardly son to be the emperor. More importantly, he left behind a son like Enchanting, who was better than the emperor in every aspect. How could the West Hill not be in chaos? Tolerant? The old man in blue threw down a chess piece and said lightly, now we can only take it that he's adapting to the circumstances. Based on his little experience on the battlefield, wanting to stop Mo Xiaoyao can be said to be wishful thinking. At this point, the two old men fell silent. They had already left the battlefield for more than 20 years and were already old. Not to mention Leitingfing, it was still unknown whether they could stop the advance of the Mahist army. Mo Lufang not only has a good son, but also a good daughter-in-law. I heard that this time, Princess Ding also followed the army to battle? The old man in blue said with a smile. As for the Princess Ding who had once defeated Enchanting, the two old generals who had been on the battlefield for a long time would not underestimate her at all. A woman who could defeat or even almost wipe out the enemy in a situation where she did not have the advantage in terms of military strength was definitely not a person to be underestimated. Who knows, maybe this time we'll be able to meet this beautiful woman. General Zhu. Bian City is in danger, I beg you to put aside your past achievements for the sake of the West Hill's safety and grant me a meeting. Leitingfing's voice came from outside again. The old man in blue, Jingtian General Zhu Yan, could not help but smile and said, this kid is really calm. Long Yang also smiled, if you don't see him, I'm afraid he won't leave. Besides, can you and I really watch Bian City fall without doing anything? Well, ask him to come in. Leitingfing left his people outside and followed the servant into the Zhu mansion alone. He believed that even if Zhu Yan and his father had a deep grudge, he would not do anything to him at this time. And he went in alone, it would also seem to show his sincerity to the old general. Stepping into the hall, he saw two white-haired old men sitting and drinking tea. Leitingfing was also surprised in his heart. When the three generals were removed from their military power, he seemed to be about 10 years old. The people in the royal family were always precocious and naturally had some impressions of these generals. Junior Leitingfing greets General Zhu and General Long Yang looked at him with a smile and said, you flatter me, Prince Rui of Genom of Gojoseon. We are just country people, we don't deserve the title of Prince General. Leitingfing smiled bitterly and helplessly. He looked up at Long Yang and said sincerely, as a junior, Tingfing does not dare to say too much about the past grievances. But now that the Mo family army has invaded the border and besieged Bian City, the West Hill is in danger. I hope that the two generals can give me some advice for the sake of my royal grandfather. For the sake of the late emperor? Long Yang sneered. When Enchanting excluded dissidents, why didn't he consider the late emperor's face? Feng Ao's whereabouts are still unknown. Why didn't Enchanting think that those people were the pillars of the West Hill and the late emperor's officials? Enchanting made a slip of the tongue. He could not refute Long Yang's question. Their standpoints were different. Even if Enchanting did not completely agree with his father's actions, he still had to admit that for the development of Jinan Palace, those thunderous measures were absolutely necessary. If those officials who were loyal to the late emperor and the current emperor's uncle had not been removed, Jinan Palace would never have the power it had today. But in the eyes of these old officials, his father's actions were no different from a state of chaos. The only thing that could be said was that the West Hill was still strong in his father's hands. Otherwise, those old officials would have attacked together before the Mahist army invaded. Chapter 652. He smiled helplessly. Now the crisis of Bian City is right in front of us. Please help us, old generals. Zhu Yan didn't speak, and Long Yang just snorted coldly. But Enchanting understood that they agreed, and he couldn't help but secretly feel relieved. The next day, the siege of the Mahist army was not as smooth as the previous days. The West Hill soldiers guarding the city seemed to have suddenly returned to their senses. Facing the murderous Mahist army, they were no longer as flustered and fearful as they were at the beginning. The defense on the tower was tight, and the entire Bian City was like an iron bucket that couldn't be broken. The siege lasted for a whole morning, and the defense of Bian City didn't weaken at all. This undoubtedly made the Mahist army generals, who had been going smoothly since the start of the expedition, feel a little anxious. At this time, their prince and princess didn't appear in front of the battle. It wasn't until near the afternoon that the Mahist army, who didn't make any progress, beat the gong to retreat. In the big tent, Mo Xiaoyao looked at the dusty generals in a good mood, without the slightest displeasure and anger. Generals, how was it? Was today's battle easy? Several young generals couldn't help but blush. Yesterday, they were the ones who clamored the most. Mo Xiaoyao smiled faintly. Don't be embarrassed, I won't blame you. If you young people who haven't fought many battles easily took down Bian City, Long Yang and Zhu Yan wouldn't have the face to call themselves the three famous generals of West Hill. Although they are old now, you have to know that the old ones are spicy. Several young generals looked at each other, and then pushed out a person to report, reporting to Prince, Bian City is completely different from the cities we attacked before. Not only are the walls strong, easy to defend and hard to attack, even the guards are completely different from the previous guards. The guards of Bian City are obviously braver and calmer. Before, we underestimated the enemy. This is the real fighting power of West Hill's army. Mo Xiaoyao nodded with satisfaction. It's good that you understand. Don't worry. I'll give you 3 more days. Can you open the gate of Bian City? Several young generals hesitated. They were all young generals who had been carefully trained by the Mahist army. Although they didn't have much experience in battle, once they put aside their previous arrogance, they could still see their position and ability clearly. Therefore, they were naturally happy that the prince could give them an important task. But now they were certain that they could take down Bian City within 3 days. They were still hesitant. Mo Xiaoyao raised his eyebrows. What? Yesterday, you were still clamoring to flatten Bian City. Today, you've only fought a battle and you've already lost your courage? No. We can. The Young's young generals. Comte General SSMO Xiaoyao relaxed and leaned back in his chair. He nodded with satisfaction and smiled. Very good. 3 days later, this prince wants to see Bian City's city gate open. And of the siege of the city. General Liu and the others have other matters to attend to. They are no longer in the camp. Everyone was dumbfounded. Only then did they realize that the older and more experienced generals were no longer there. At this time, the people standing in the large tent were all young people under the age of 30. What to do? They couldn't even find someone to ask for advice. After these young generals had left, Yi Li, who was sitting on the side reading, raised her head and asked, "Can these young people do it?" Zhuo Jing and Qin Feng, who were standing not far away, looked at each other. They couldn't help but lower their heads and laugh. Every time they heard Wang Fei talk about these young generals, it always made them want to laugh. It was true that these young generals could be called young generals under any circumstances, but even so, most of them were older than Wang Fei by 2 years. Especially since Wang Fei looked younger than her actual age. It was strange for a woman in her 20s to call a group of men in their 20s young people. Mo Xiaoyao said lazily, a famous sword has to be tempered thousands of times before it can be used. They are still too inexperienced. It is not a bad thing to take more blows. Won't this blow be too big? Not just these young people, Yi Li and Mo Xiaoyao were also studying the defense of Bian City. Even Mo Xiaoyao himself could not say that a direct attack could open the gates of Bian City. Also, this kind of war of attrition was not suitable for them who had limited military strength deep in Xiling. Mo Xiaoyao did not care. Yes, after they can withstand this blow, they will be able to withstand most of the blows in the future. The pressure of the two famous generals of Xiling was definitely enough. At the same time, he wanted to see if these two were old. Thus, the Mahist army led by a few young people began to attack Bian City every day. But Bian City's watertight defense showed no signs of being shaken. In the last 2 days, the defenders of Bian City simply ignored the provocations from below. As long as there was no one attacking the gates and no one climbing the walls, the defenders above would do what they were supposed to do most of the time. In the face of such a situation, the young generals clearly felt a sense of contempt from the enemy. The enemy was not afraid of them, but simply disdained to pay attention to them. This made the young and vigorous young generals unable to bear it. They simply let people take turns to curse at the bottom of the city. Even Long Yang and Zhu Yan's 8 generations of ancestors were cursed. Hearing this, Mo Xiaoyao, who was looking at them from behind, laughed until he fell down. At the same time, the 2 old generals in Bian City were also very happy. Haha, these boys are interesting. I like them. They liked them, but others did not like them. Even Lei Tingfeng could not help but anxiously say, General Long, General Zhu, are we just going to let them do as they please? Let them curse like this? Long Yang said lightly, cursing a few words won't cost you anything. It is not your saliva that will be wasted. What are you worried about? But that group of boys cursed very harshly. The generals present silently said in their hearts, if we let them be arrogant like this, will it damage the morale of our army? Lei Tingfeng frowned and asked. Zhu Yan sneered and said, if being cursed by a few words will damage the morale, then what is the point of fighting a war? In addition, if they curse you, can't you curse back? Everyone was different. They were going to fight a war, not a war of words. Long Yang shook his head and sighed. He asked, what do you think of the fighting power of the Mahist army? Lei Tingfeng frowned and said with some doubts, the Mahist army is indeed brave, but they are not as powerful as the legends say. Moreover, although the level of the general seems to be good, they are not particularly superb. Could it be, they are hiding their strength and want us to relax our vigilance? Long Yang said, in these days, the soldiers who led the attack were all young generals under 30 years old. What are the main generals of the Mahist army doing? Are they hiding in the big tent and sleeping? After listening to Long Yang's words, Lei Tingfeng became even more uneasy. He did notice that in these days, those who attacked the city were all unfamiliar young faces. Not to mention Mo Xiaoyao, even the well-known people such as Lu Jingxian and Feng Zhiao did not even show their faces. What do they want to do? General, please give me some pointers. Chapter 653. Long Yang and Zhu Yan sighed and said, find out as soon as possible whether Mo Xiaoyao and Lu Jingxian are still in the Mahist army camp. Not to mention Lei Tingfeng, even they couldn't figure out what Mo Xiaoyao wanted to do. If Mo Xiaoyao had time to slowly confront them, it was impossible. Even if the Mahist army won all the battles along the way, this was still the land of West Hill. Once the war dragged on for a long time, not to mention Lei Tingfeng's troops, other reinforcements from other places would gradually come. At that time, the Mahist army would be surrounded by millions of Xiling army. Therefore, the Mahist army could not afford to delay time. It was also impossible to say that there was any other shortcut. Zhu Yan had lived in Bian City for more than 20 years, and no one knew the scenery around Bian City better than him. Bian City was surrounded by flat land, and there was a moat outside the city. There was no other way except for a frontal attack, and it was even more impossible to bypass Bian City. Bian City was located on the east and west main roads. If the Mahist army did not take Bian City, even if they bypassed it, their military supplies would be cut off at any time. Lei Tingfeng felt a chill in his heart and quickly responded, yes, I will immediately send people to check. Waving his hand to let everyone retreat, Zhu Yan sighed tiredly and said, I'm old. Long Yang looked at him and smiled, how about it? How does Mo Xiaoyao compare with Mo Lufang? Zhu Yan shook his head and said, it's hard to say. At least Mo Xiaoyao's ability to hide his intentions is better than his father's. At that time, I could at least guess Mo Xiaoyao's thoughts, but now? I really don't understand what Mo Xiaoyao wants to do. Really, I have to admit that I'm old. When he said this, he couldn't help but feel a little more miserable. Wasn't it the saddest thing in the world for a general to have white hair and old beauty? Hearing this, Long Yang couldn't help but feel sad. If it was the young Long Yang, he definitely wouldn't be sitting here and chatting. Back then, he was the god of slaughter of the western regions, and he was always good at taking the initiative to attack instead of passively defending a city. But now, could they still mount their war horses? Old Dragon, can we defend Bian City? He raised his eyes and looked down at the city, looking through the battlements into the distance. In the distance, a dark mass of banners was fluttering in the wind. The murderous aura was oppressive. Although the young people who were clamoring at the city gate were immature, they were full of vigor and fighting spirit that they didn't have. If the two sides were not opposing each other, he could not help but praise such an elite army. For the first time in his life, Zhu Yan asked with uncertainty. Long Yang smiled faintly and said, "Loyalty in life, loyalty in death." He would do his best. Zhu Yan, this is the first time I've heard that you have no confidence. Zhu Yan shook his head and said with a wry smile, "It's probably because I haven't been on the battlefield for too many years. Well, it's enough to be able to fight with the descendants of the Prince Ding mansion in my lifetime. Don't be so discouraged. Don't think that I don't know that you still have an elite army hidden in your hands. Even if Bian City can't be defended, those people are enough to make the Mahist army suffer." Long Yang glanced at him and said lightly. After Zhu Yan was stripped of his military power, he didn't live in seclusion in the mountains like him, nor did he disappear like Feng Ao. Instead, he chose to settle down in a bustling place like Bian City, even at the risk of being monitored by Jinan Palace. It was because he still had an elite army in his hands that others didn't know about. Even Genin of Gojoseon didn't know about it, but Long Yang, who had a close friendship with Emperor Xianwen like Zhu Yan, knew about it. Because when Emperor Xianwen gave this elite army to Zhu Yan, he was next to him. The most important responsibility of this elite army was to guard against the Prince Ding mansion. The late emperor was far-sighted. Except for the fact that he couldn't choose an excellent heir, everything about him was enough to be admired. Zhu Yan was stunned, and his white eyebrows gradually wrinkled. Suddenly, he said in a deep voice, "Oh no." "What?" Long Yang didn't understand. Zhu Yan said, "The Prince Ding mansion must have known about the existence of that elite army." How? Long Yang couldn't help but become serious. This elite army could be said to be the most secretive army in West Hill. Even Genin of Gojoseon, who always monitored Zhu Yan, didn't know about it. How could the Prince Ding mansion know about it? Zhu Yan closed his eyes and said, "The Mahist army's attack on West Hill is definitely not accidental. I'm afraid that Mo Xiaoyao has already calculated it. If he had already made up his mind, why didn't he send someone to secretly investigate?" "You mean, 6 years ago, you and I both thought that Prince Ding would attack West Hill, but in the end, nothing happened." Long Yang's expression changed and said, "You mean, since then, Mo Xiaoyao has already been calculating how to take West Hill. At that time, he stopped just because he wasn't ready?" Zhu Yan nodded and sighed. "Now, he is ready. Even Lei Tingfeng didn't know you were in Bian City before he came, but you just heard it? Those young people even scolded you. It shows that they already knew you were in Bian City." Long Yang's wrinkled face was a little paler. Mo Xiaoyao didn't intend to attack Bian City at all. He's only surrounding Bian City because he wants to eliminate your elite troops first. Obviously so. Then now, Zhu Yan shook his head and said, "Now you and I can't go out. We can only resign ourselves to fate." The room was silent for a moment. Long Yang suddenly slammed the table and said angrily, "Resign ourselves to fate my ass. I've been fighting all my life. If I resigned myself to fate, I would have died long ago. Mo Xiaoyao wants to trap us first? I'd like to see who can be trapped by those guys. I don't believe that, a mere 400,000 troops can be used as 1 million. The Mahist army only had 400,000 soldiers and horses no matter how elite they were. Bian City now had 500,000 soldiers and horses, plus more than 100,000 elite soldiers in secret. Their strength was far more than the Mahist army. If they were still trapped in Bian City, they might as well take a sword and slit their own throats." Zhu Yan's eyes flashed. "You're right. Come, ask Prince Genim of Gojoseon to come here." Chapter 654. Long Yang and Zhu Yan couldn't help but worry about Mo Xiaoyao's intentions. After receiving the news from Lei Tingfeng that many troops of the Mahist army had secretly left, their worries became a reality. Zhu Yan sat in the chair and was silent for a long time. He sighed and said, "Well, it's really the Mahist army." Looking at the two old generals' expressions, Leitingfeng also knew that things had changed. He asked worriedly, "Old general, what happened?" Zhu Yan and Long Yang looked at each other and finally told him what had happened. At this time, it didn't make any sense to hide this kind of thing. After listening to Long Yang and Zhu Yan, Leitingfeng was also shocked. "General Zhu, you mean, you still have hundreds of thousands of elite soldiers in your hands?" Speaking of this, he couldn't help but look at Long Yang next to him with surprise. In the past 20 years, the Lord of Zhenan's mansion had been carefully monitoring Zhu Yan, who lived in Bian City. In the past 20 years, he had never contacted his former subordinates, and even in Bian City, he rarely went out. Leitingfeng was almost completely at ease with him, but he didn't expect that the other party was actually secretly holding onto an army of more than 100,000 elite soldiers. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers and horses looked insignificant in West Hill's total military strength of nearly 3 million and could be increased at any time. But if used on the edge of a knife, it was very terrible. For example, in the past 20 years, his father had come to Bian City several times. If Zhu Yan suddenly attacked at that time, Leitingfeng's heart trembled and he didn't dare to think about it anymore. He finally understood why his father had always been on guard against these old generals. It was said that the civil officials and powerful officials disrupted the government, but the ones who could really change the dynasty and usurp the throne were generally military generals. Without military power, everything was just empty talk. As if he understood what Leitingfeng was thinking, Long Yang snorted and said, "This elite army was personally given to Zhu Yan by the late emperor. Even the current emperor has no right to take it back. Why should Zhenan Palace know? What's more, this elite troop was originally prepared to guard against the Prince Ding mansion." Leitingfeng remained silent. He believed Long Yang's words. However, there were some things that couldn't be solved just by believing. But now was not the time to discuss this matter. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers. What's the use of fighting against the Mahist army? Idiot. Zhu Yan snorted and said, the late emperor was wise and far-sighted. He knew that the Mahist army was the biggest enemy of the West Hill. Therefore, he had long prepared a bargaining chip to deal with the Mahist army. If not for the sudden death of the late emperor, how could he have? There was also Enchanting. Back then, the Prince Ding mansion suffered a great loss. In order to eliminate his dissidents, he had wasted a great opportunity. It was only because the snake was not killed that the Mo family's army arrived at the city gates today. Leitingfeng was speechless. When the Mahist army suffered a great loss and Mo Xiaoyao was seriously injured and dying, it was the time when the royalists in the West Hill were the most active. In order to attack these people, his father gave up a great opportunity to attack the Dechu state. However, at that time, who really believed that Mo Xiaoyao could stand up again? Even if they didn't participate in the poisoning of Mo Xiaoyao, it didn't mean that they didn't know anything. Old general, what should we do now? Leitingfeng saw that the atmosphere was not right, so he quickly turned the topic back and asked. Zhu Yan sighed and said, Old Long, you help the crown prince to defend the city. I'll go and meet the famous Prince Ding. Zhu Yan. Long Yang frowned. He was a few years older than Zhu Yan, but Zhu Yan was not young either. It was too dangerous to go out of the city in person. Zhu Yan waved his hand and said, it doesn't matter. I can still move. You're right. I can't just watch Mo Xiaoyao devour my hundreds of thousands of elite soldiers. Long Yang also knew that this was the best choice. He sighed and said, well, you be careful. I'll hold back some of the Mahist army for you in the city. Take care. Take care. The two white-haired old men looked at each other and solemnly said goodbye. Zhu Yan turned and left. His slightly trembling body seemed to straighten up in an instant. Long Yang looked at his friend's figure and closed his eyes. He told Leitingfeng beside him, go and get ready. We'll go out of the city to fight. It was already the afternoon of the third day. The Mahist army under the city wall kept shouting and cursing. The West Hill defenders on the city wall also did not stay idle. They also unceremoniously returned the curses. The two countries came from the same origin and there were no cultural differences. There was no obstacle in cursing. If they were cursing with Nanzhao and Beirong, most of the people would not understand. In front of the army, Yunting and Qinyun rode side by side, looking at the distant city tower. Yunting said anxiously, aren't Long Yang and Zhu Yan the famous generals of West Hill? Why are they hiding like turtles? Qinyun shrugged helplessly. How would he know? Don't tell me they want to stall for time? Stall for time until Enchanting comes back to help? Qinyun said with some uncertainty. Don't joke. When Enchanting arrives, it will be a month later at the earliest. Yunting said. They only had 3 days. Now the 3 days were almost up and they had not even touched the edge of Bien City's city tower. In the past 3 days, they had tried all kinds of methods, such as strong attacks and sneak attacks. But they had to admit that it was reasonable for the old general to come out. They could not find a loophole in Bien City's defense. Such a blow made the young general's faces more and more ugly day by day. At this time, Yunting's face was still green. In fact, if Yunting knew that not only him, but even his prince's wife could not find a loophole in Bien City's defense, he would not be so depressed. Look, are they coming out? Qinyun pointed to the fluttering flag on the wall. Obviously, there were people and horses moving very quickly. Yunting's eyes narrowed, and a sneer appeared on his young face. Zhu Yan. Brothers, continue to scold him. The Mahist army behind him once again loudly greeted Zhu Yan's 8 generations of ancestors and relatives. Long Yang led people to appear on the wall, squinting at the young man who was showing off under the city wall. He smiled and said, "Young man, tell me your name." Yunting said proudly, "I am Yunting, the deputy general of the Eagle Army of the Mahist Army's 9th Division." Long Yang was stunned. Such an obviously different organization from the general army made him unable to determine Yunting's identity for a while. But from Yunting's age, he could guess a thing or two. Such a young and high-spirited young man, 80% could not be the general of an army. He looked at Yunting with a smile and said, "Where is the general of the Mahist army? Or is there no one in the Mahist army?" Yunting was not happy. He looked up at the old man on the wall and said, "I am the general. It's just Bien City, I don't need to trouble others. I will let you see the ability of the Mahist army." Long Yang was not angry, as if he was looking at an ignorant child. He smiled and said, "What? Then let me see the ability of the young general of the Mahist army. And I am not Zhu Yan." Long Yang. Yunting gnashed his teeth. Chapter 655. Indeed, the older, the wiser. Yunting was already at a disadvantage even before the battle started. They had only exchanged a few words. Below the city tower, the originally closed city gate suddenly opened, and the drawbridge over the moat was lowered. The West Hill soldiers who had been hiding in the city rushed out like a tide towards the Mahist army. These days, not only were the Mahist army soldiers sullen, but also the soldiers brought by Lei Tingfeng as reinforcements. Being insulted by the enemy without being able to charge down and kill them was the greatest humiliation as a soldier. Now that they could finally leave the city, these soldiers naturally rushed towards the Mahist army soldiers who had been showing off in front of them for the past few days. The battle was on the verge of breaking out. For a moment, the sound of war drums and killing filled the sky outside the city. On the city tower, Long Yang calmly looked at the killing below the city. Whether it was the Mahist army or the Shilin army, their fighting power could be said to be quite good. Therefore, when the strong met, the killing was naturally very intense. Long Yang looked at the young white-robed general below the city with a faint smile. He raised his hand and waved the small red flag in his hand. The West Hill soldiers in gray armor quickly changed their formation under the guidance of the flag. Standing on the city tower, they could clearly see the entire battlefield. The Black Missouri family army camp was quickly surrounded and split apart by the gray tide of people, before being destroyed one by one. Yunting's reaction was not slow. He also ordered the formation as quickly as possible. However, he was still one step behind Long Yang. The Shilin army's formation changed again. Like a gray dragon, it was wantonly killing the Mahist army. Although the Mahist army was brave, the battlefield was not something that could be solved by a single soldier's bravery. When a Mahist army soldier faced 3 West Hill soldiers at the same time, when a small team of Mahist army soldiers was surrounded by a large team of West Hill soldiers, Yunting could only watch as the soldiers around him fell one by one in front of him. He abruptly turned around and saw the white-clothed old man standing on the city wall. He was dressed in plain clothes and looked like an inconspicuous villager. However, the confidence and arrogance in the old man's eyes revealed that he was not an ordinary person. Yunting shouldn't have been able to see the other party's expression from such a distance. However, Yunting clearly felt that he was as insignificant as an ant in the other party's eyes. "Yunting! What are you doing? Charge out!" Qinyun kicked away the stunned Yunting. An arrow narrowly missed the spot where Yunting was originally standing. Qinyun glared at him in annoyance. "How dare you daydream on the battlefield? You must be tired of living." Yunting came back to his senses. At that moment, he was so intimidated by Long Yang's aura that he forgot that he was on the battlefield. Yunting dodged the sword that came slashing at him. Cold sweat dripped down his forehead. This was the true power of the god of slaughter of the western region. The sound of the retreat was heard from behind. The Mahist army no longer lingered in the battle and broke through the Shilling army's encirclement to kill their way out. However, the Mahist army retreated in a sorry state that they had never been in for many years. On the city wall, Long Yang also signaled for the retreat of the Mahist army after seeing them retreat. Lei Tingfeng frowned and said, "General, why don't we pursue them?" Long Yang said calmly, "Today was just a test. It seems that the Mahist army has indeed split up. Just now, the Mahist army was about to be defeated, but no one came to help. Instead, they retreated. Then, don't worry. We'll test them again tomorrow," Long Yang said in a low voice. After losing the battle, Yunting and his men returned to the camp dejectedly and prepared to ask for forgiveness from the prince's consort. However, Zhuojing, who was guarding outside the tent, told him that the prince's consort had something to do. All the military affairs were temporarily handed over to Qinyun and Yunting. Yunting was so frightened that he almost fell to the ground. Qinyun, who was behind him, was also pale. It was not that they looked down on themselves, but with their experience, they were not even qualified to command an army. How could they command the entire Mahist army? The two of them looked at each other and broke out in cold sweat. Yunting looked at Zhuojing for help. Zhuojing shrugged and patted Yunting's shoulder helplessly. "Since the prince ordered you to do so, it means that he trusts your abilities. Don't worry. But we just lost the battle," Yunting said shamefully. He had thought that he would be punished by military law for not completing the task given by the prince. But in the current situation, it would be better to be punished by military law. Zhuojing smiled calmly. "You almost lost just now. You haven't lost yet, have you?" He gave the two of them a look that said, "I have faith in you." Zhuojing turned and went back to the battle. Yunting wanted to cry but had no tears. "If you hadn't retreated just now, I might have died on the battlefield." 100 miles southwest of Bian City was a small county town. The entire county town was less than 1/10 the size of Bian City, but its location was on the official road between the city of the Emperor of Shilling and Bian City. In other words, if the troops from the west wanted to reach Bian City as quickly as possible, they would have to pass through here. 3 days ago, Zhang Qilan was ordered by Mo Xiuyao to lead 70,000 troops to occupy this small town. Because Shiling's main defense was Bian City, such a small town's military strength was naturally weak. Zhang Qilan almost effortlessly took over this small town. Then the 70,000 troops were stationed in this small town, seemingly doing nothing. But Zhang Qilan knew that there was a group of more than 100,000 elite troops nearby. Even though the Mahist army had sent out their most elite troops, Qilin, they still couldn't find their specific location. But Zhang Qilan knew that they were hiding in the mountains about 30 miles away. It wasn't wise for the Mahist army to enter the mountains with their military strength, so Zhang Qilan waited here. If this group of troops wanted to approach Bian City, they would have to pass by him. He wasn't in a hurry. Not far from the small town, on a small road that deviated from the official road, a group of Mahist army soldiers were chasing a group of people. There were only 5 people in this group. 4 men were protecting a young girl in plain clothes as they fought and retreated. Although the 4 men were skilled, there were too many soldiers chasing them. Moreover, the Mahist army soldiers weren't ordinary people. The 4 of them were already covered in wounds, but they didn't forget to protect the young girl in the middle. "Miss, hurry and leave. We'll block them. Go to the capital to find." One of the men used force to push the young girl towards the narrow road in front of them. Unfortunately, before he could finish his words, he was stabbed in the abdomen and fell to the ground. The remaining 3 didn't have time to look at their companions. One of them pulled the young girl and ran forward, while the other 2 stayed behind to block the Mahist army soldiers chasing them. The 2 of them ran wildly. Unfortunately, they didn't run far before the young girl fell to the ground, gasping for breath. "I can't walk anymore, you guys go." "No. Miss, hurry and leave. You must return to the capital. Don't forget, the general wants you to live well," the guard said sternly, pulling the young girl towards the side of the road into the forest. Not long after, the footsteps of the soldiers chasing them could be heard. It was obvious that the 2 guards who stayed behind had died in battle. Chapter 656. The 2 of them hid in the thistles and thorns in the forest, and the pursuing soldiers found that they had lost track of them. Some of them searched for nearly an hour, using their swords and spears to randomly stab and hack at the thorny bushes that could hide people. In the end, they still couldn't find any trace of the two people. Only then did they gradually leave, taking the bodies of the dead guards back to receive their rewards. The forest gradually quieted down, and after a long time, the thistles and bushes on the side of the road moved. A young girl in a sorry state crawled out from the bushes and pushed the person beside her. "Wake up! Wake up!" Her slender white hands were covered in blood, and the young girl was so frightened that she immediately cried out. It turned out that when the soldiers were searching, the guard used his body to block the swords that were slashing at the bushes. There was a long wound on his back that was continuously bleeding, and he had already fallen unconscious. The pale young girl looked at the desolate wilderness in front of her and the only person she could rely on who was unconscious. She finally could not help but cry. In the midst of her drowsy crying, she vaguely saw a moon-white figure appear in front of her. The young girl raised her head in confusion. "Save me!" The young man wearing moon-white clothes silently looked at the man and woman who had already fainted in front of him, a pair of sword-like eyebrows on his handsome face slightly wrinkled. He lowered his head to look at the man's injuries. The numerous wounds on his body and the almost fatal stab on his back were enough to show that the man had experienced a difficult battle. Although the young girl was wearing ordinary cotton clothes, her beautiful face and slender hands were enough to show that she should have been pampered and spoiled since childhood. Originally, he could have saved them, and even the guards who had died, he could have saved them. But his special identity meant that he had to think twice before he acted, so he had been secretly watching the guards die one by one, watching the young girl cry helplessly in the wilderness. "Young master, what should we do?" the guard following behind him asked in a low voice. The man was silent for a moment, and then said, "I just heard the guard say something about a general. Which general's daughter is she?" The guard shook his head and said, "This subordinate does not know. Presumably, she is the daughter of a general who was defeated by the Mahist army." The man thought for a moment and said, "See if they have any tokens on them." The guard stepped forward and squatted down. Very quickly, he found a piece of cloth from the unconscious guard's body. Then, he took a purple jade bracelet from the girl's wrist and respectfully handed it to the handsome man in white. The man took it and looked at it. He frowned and said, "It's the imperial bodyguard of the Tiger General, Yang Hu. This purple jade bracelet was a tribute from the western regions during the previous emperor's reign. The previous emperor bestowed it to the Grand Preceptor. Lord Ling Hui's wife is Lord Ling's daughter." The guard said in a low voice, "So, this lady is the daughter of the Hui general?" General Hui, who was stationed in Li City, had passed away 10 days ago. "This girl?" The man pondered for a long time before finally saying, "Bring him back." In the hidden depths of the mountains, there were many courtyards and houses. Under the cover of the dense forest and perennial clouds, it was almost impossible for outsiders to find any trace of it. In a simple and crude room, a sleeping girl seemed to have suddenly woken up from a nightmare and sat down abruptly. Then, she saw a handsome young man sitting not far away from her. "Ah? Save." "Shut up," the young man said in a low voice. The girl hid in the innermost part of the bed in fear and wrapped herself tightly in the blanket. Who are you?" The young man said in a low voice, "I should be the one asking you that. Who are you?" The girl bit her red lips and refused to speak. "Where did Alin go?" He's still." The girl trembled, as if she did not dare to continue asking. The man said calmly, "He's still alive, if that's what you want to ask." Hearing this, the girl sighed in relief. That's good. You saved us?" The man did not deny it. Instead, he asked lightly, "Who are you?" My name is Yang Xianya. My father is the Tiger General." My father? As she spoke, the girl's eyes reddened. Crystal-clear tears fell from the corners of her eyes, and she slowly sobbed. The man frowned slightly and sighed. "I know, the Tiger General died in battle 10 days ago. Did he ask the guards to escort you out?" The girl, Yang Xianya, nodded. She bit her lips and said in a low voice, "Before Li City fell, my father had already asked people to escort me back to the capital. Originally, there were 12 of them. But now, there's only Alin left." The man frowned and thought for a moment before asking, "Why did the Mahist army pursue you so relentlessly?" Although she was the daughter of the Tiger General, she was not that important to the Mahist army. This kind of relentless pursuit was very unreasonable. The girl shook her head in confusion. "I don't know. My father only told me to go back to the capital to find my uncle." The man stood up and said, "I understand. Rest well. When you're better, I'll send someone to escort you back to the capital." Then, he turned and walked out. "You. Xianya still doesn't know your name. I'll definitely repay you for saving my life when I return to the capital," the girl said in a low voice. The man paused and said lightly, Zhu Ling. When the man went out, the guards were already waiting outside. When they saw him come out, they quickly greeted him. Young master, we've already checked. The late Grand Tutorling's daughter married the Tiger General and had only one daughter. General Yang and his wife loved this daughter very much. It's not an exaggeration to say that they doted on her. Now, Lord Ling, who is Miss Yang's uncle, also treats this niece as his own. It's said that Miss Yang is 17 this year and has been engaged to her cousin, the Ling family's eldest son, since she was young. If it weren't for the sudden attack from the northwest, General Yang would have brought his daughter back to the capital to hold the wedding. The man nodded. I've already asked, and it's pretty much the same as what you said? The guard asked. Then, can her words be trusted? Zhu Ling said, let her stay first. Grandfather has a good relationship with the Ling family. If she's really the Ling family's granddaughter and we don't save her, we won't be able to explain it to the Ling family. Send someone to watch over them. Yes, young master. Chapter 657. The mountains were shrouded in clouds and mist all year round, so it was rare to see direct sunlight even on normal days. Thus, in the western hill, where most of the land was relatively dry, this mountain range was a rare moist and green place. At the entrance of the small courtyard, a delicate and pale girl was stopped before she could reach the door. Who is it? Yang Xianya was startled and said with some trepidation, I want to check on Lin's injuries. The guard standing at the entrance of the courtyard was expressionless, as if he was not moved by the weak girl in front of him. Young master has instructed Miss to recuperate in the courtyard. Guard Lin will naturally come and meet Miss when he has recovered. Yang Xianya bit her lips and said in a low voice, but I'm very worried. Woo-woo. I don't know anyone around me. Only him. I beg you, let me go see him. Seeing the girl crying pitifully in front of them, the two guards were somewhat hesitant. After all, the young master had brought her back and ordered them to take good care of her. Miss, please wait. We will go and report to the young master. In the end, the guards could only compromise. What happened? Yang Xianya was about to thank them when Zhu Ling's voice came from outside the door. The guards hurriedly bowed and stood side by side. Yang Xianya was about to explain what happened to her guard. Zhu Ling raised his eyebrows and looked at the pale girl with a trace of panic in front of him, deep in thought. Yang Xianya asked carefully, Young Master Zhu, how is Lin's injuries? When can we return to the capital? Zhu Gongzi, please send someone to escort the two of us back to the capital. When we return to the capital, my daughter and the Ling family will be grateful to you. Zhu Ling's eyes flashed and he looked at Yang Xianya with a gentler expression. He smiled faintly and said, Don't worry, Miss Yang. When you recover, I will send someone to escort you back to the capital. However, Guard Lin's injuries are not light. I'm afraid he will have to lie down for a few days. Yang Xianya sighed in relief and nodded, Thank you, young Master Zhu. It's good that Lin is fine. May I go see him? Zhu Ling smiled. Miss Yang can just look at him from the door. It's best not to look at his injuries. This one has already sent someone back to the capital to deliver a letter to young Master Ling. Perhaps it won't be long before young Master Ling personally comes to pick up Miss Yang. Hearing this, Yang Xianya showed a trace of joy and relief. That's great, thank you, young Master Zhu. Young Master Zhu is indeed a good person. Zhu Ling smiled faintly, Not at all, Miss Yang is the descendant of valiant bravery. These matters are only a small matter for this one. After comforting Yang Xianya, who was worried about the guards, and sending her back to her room, Zhu Ling left the small courtyard and went to the outer courtyard. Although this courtyard built in the middle of the mountain forest was particularly simple compared to other courtyards in the city, it still had two entrances, and the study was in the corner of the outer courtyard. After entering the study, the guard behind him said, Young Master, it seems that this Miss Yang is indeed the daughter of the Hu-Wei general. Just now, young Master said that young Master Ling was coming, but I didn't see her acting strangely. Zhu Ling nodded and sat down behind the desk. He said tiredly, This is a special period. It is always good to be careful. Has the guard called Lin woken up? The guard nodded and said, He just woke up not long ago. His injuries are too serious. The knife on his back almost took his life. The situation he described is similar to what Miss Yang said. When the Mahist army first entered Li City, General Yang arranged for more than 10 people to escort Miss Yang back to the capital to join the Ling family. However, they didn't expect the Mahist army to attack the city so quickly. They had just left Li City when the city fell. When they disguised themselves as normal people and passed by the small county that Zhang Qilan took over, they accidentally exposed their identities and were chased by the Mahist army. Zhu Ling frowned and nodded. It seems that this Lin is still loyal. Have the doctor use the best medicine and heal his injuries as soon as possible. Yes, young master. Is there any news from grandfather? Changing the topic, Zhu Ling asked about serious matters. The guard's expression also became more worried. He shook his head and said, "No, ever since Bian City was surrounded by the Mahist army, there has been no news from the old general. Zhang Qilan is guarding the county, and anyone who goes in and out has to go through strict checks. I'm afraid that even if the old general wanted to send a letter, he wouldn't be able to. Young master, are we going to hide here forever? Are we going to let Zhang Qilan occupy the main road in and out of Bian City? Although Bian City has abundant reserves, if it is continuously surrounded for 1 or 2 months, it will still be a bit difficult." Zhu Ling thought for a moment and shook his head. "No, Mo Xiaoyao won't do that. He is in a hurry. After 1 or 2 months, the reinforcements from all over Xiling will be able to reach Bian City. At that time, his mere 400,000 soldiers, no matter how powerful they are, will be like a dragon in shallow water or a tiger in the plains." "Young master, you mean?" Zhu Ling frowned and said, "Mo Xiaoyao doesn't have many soldiers to begin with. At this time, he can still divide tens of thousands of soldiers to occupy a small county. I suspect, he already knows of our existence." The guard was also shocked and said, "Prince Ding sent Zhang Qilan to guard Bian City to prevent us from reinforcing Bian City and outflanking him." Zhu Ling raised his hand and pressed between his eyebrows and said, "I'm more inclined to think that he wants Zhang Qilan to annihilate us. How is that possible?" The guard snorted and said in disbelief, "Not to mention that we are familiar with the terrain here, which is far from what the Mahist army can compare to. In terms of military strength, Zhang Qilan's mere tens of thousands of soldiers and horses are not our opponents." Zhu Ling shook his head and sighed. "Mo Xiaoyao won't do anything useless. Send people down the mountain to investigate the situation of Bian City and the Mahist army." "Yes, young master." 2 days later, Zhu Ling was sitting in the study and playing chess with Yang Xianya. After a few days of interaction, the girl's initial fear and uneasiness had finally faded. Especially after knowing that Zhu Ling was the grandson of the old general Zhu Yan, she was completely relieved. Although she was still young and had never seen the old general Zhu Yan, she had heard her grandfather and uncles mention him. The Zhu family and the Ling family also had some friendship. The girl, whose fear and uneasiness had faded away, gradually became cheerful. Only then did Zhu Ling realize that the girl was not like ordinary West Hill women who were not good at zither, chess, calligraphy, or painting. On the contrary, she was good at calligraphy and painting. Although he had never heard of her playing the zither, her chess skills were also very good. She was completely unlike the so-called tigress of a general's family. But thinking that General Yang's wife was the daughter of the former Grand Preceptor of West Hill, which could be said to be one of the most famous scholarly families in West Hill, all of this made sense. Although Zhu Ling was born in a general's family, he grew up in a place like Bian City. Longshan Academy, one of the 3 major academies in the world, was located in Bian City. Zhu Ling grew up under the guidance of a famous scholar. However, due to many reasons, he could only stay in such a mountain forest all year round with these illiterate soldiers. Now, it was rare to meet a talented person. Even if it was a girl, it was enough for the two to have a good conversation. "Young master, I have something to report." Someone outside the door reported loudly, "You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure."